Hey, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Before we begin tonight, one small thing. If this channel becomes a place you want to return to, if the voice and the stories and the slow pace of it feel like the right company for the late hours, would you consider subscribing? And if this particular story moves you, a like helps more than I can explain. It takes about 2 seconds and it keeps this little corner of the internet alive. That's all. No pressure. Do it when it feels right. Dim the lights a little if you can. Pull your blanket up. Get truly, properly horizontal. Drop a comment when you have a moment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. A bedroom in Edinburgh, a couch in Melbourne, a dorm room in Ohio. I read every single one, and there is something I find genuinely wonderful about knowing all these different people, in all these different places, settling in at the same time to hear the same story. All right. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. Tonight we're going somewhere specific and intimate and overlooked. We're going to a bedroom. A Victorian bedroom. Not the grand dressing room of a duchess with 40 gowns and a lady's maid who speaks 4 languages. Not a room from a period drama with perfect lighting and a maid who appears and disappears like smoke. We're going to an ordinary room. A room that belongs to an ordinary woman. Maybe she is the wife of a solicitor in Bristol. Maybe she is the daughter of a country doctor somewhere in Shropshire. A little too old to still be at home, a little too young to have stopped caring about such things. Maybe she's a widow with a modest income in Edinburgh, living alone in rooms that are respectable but not lavish, keeping up appearances with the quiet determination of someone who has always understood that appearances are not nothing. She has been awake since before 7 this morning. She has written letters. She has supervised the household accounts with the kind of meticulous attention that no one will notice or thank her for. She has received a caller she didn't particularly want to see. She has read for perhaps 20 minutes in the afternoon, the only 20 minutes of the day that belonged entirely to her, and even then she felt a little guilty about it. And now it is approaching 9 o'clock in the evening. The fire in the grate has burned down from its earlier height. The candles on the writing desk have pooled wax into their holders. The sounds of the street below, a carriage, the distant bark of a dog, the particular creak of gas lamps doing nothing useful for the shadows on the ceiling, are quieting, one by one. She's about to begin the process of undoing herself, of unpacking, layer by layer, everything that the day required of her, and what that process actually looked like, what it involved, what it meant, what it cost, what it gave back, is one of the most genuinely interesting and consistently overlooked stories in the history of daily life. This is the story of a Victorian woman's night. Not the grand version, not the theatrical version, the real one. Let us start not with the undressing, though that is coming. It is complicated and fascinating and will take us a while, but with something even earlier, with the hour before it, with the space between the social evening if there had been one, or the long, quiet evening at home, and the actual moment of retreat to the bedroom. Because Victorian evenings had a rhythm, and understanding that rhythm helps you understand everything else. For a middle-class Victorian woman, and middle class in the Victorian era covered an enormous range, from the factory owner's wife who kept a cook and 2 housemaids, to the widow of a minor clergyman who kept no servants at all and did her own cleaning while pretending she didn't. The evening existed in 2 distinct parts. There was the performed evening, the social hours, which might mean receiving guests or going out, or in many households simply sitting in the parlour with one's husband or family in the particular structured togetherness that Victorian domesticity demanded. And then there was the private evening, the hour or 2 after the social obligations concluded, when the house began to close down around her. The closing of the house was itself a ritual. In households with servants, it involved a sequence of tasks distributed across the hierarchy of the domestic staff, and the lady of the house's role in it was mostly supervisory, though supervision carried its own exhaustions. Doors were bolted, windows were checked. The kitchen fire, which had been burning in some form since before anyone in the household woke that morning, was damped for the night. The lamps in the hallways were turned down. The parlour fire was guarded or banked depending on the season and the household's preferences. Each of these acts was a small ceremony of closing, of drawing the world in, of declaring the day finished. In households without servants, and there were many, especially toward the later Victorian decades as the servant-keeping class began to quietly contract. The woman herself managed most of this. She moved through her rooms in the last hour of the evening, performing the small practical gestures of shutdown that kept a household safe and functional through the night. She was the last person in most rooms. She knew every corner of her house in a way that only someone responsible for its maintenance could know it. And then she climbed the stairs. The act of going upstairs to bed in a Victorian home was more transitional than it might sound. It meant crossing a threshold. Going up meant leaving the social self behind. It meant entering the one space in the entire house where the rules shifted, where the performance of daily life loosened its grip just slightly, just enough to breathe differently. The bedroom, in Victorian domestic ideology, was the most private room in the house. This sounds obvious, and yet it carried weight in that particular era that it does not quite carry for us. Victorian life was conducted almost entirely in public, or in spaces that might as well have been public. The parlour was a performance space. The dining room was a performance space. Even the garden was a performance space, a place where you could be observed from the street or the neighbours' windows. Privacy was scarce and therefore precious, and the bedroom was its primary home. Some Victorian domestic advice books described the bedroom as the sanctuary of the self. Others more practically described it as the place where health was either made or ruined, which was a way of elevating its importance without quite acknowledging the emotional truth underneath, that this room was where you got to stop pretending, at least partly for a few hours a night. What a Victorian woman did in that room, in those hours between entering it for the night and finally falling asleep, was shaped by everything: her class, her health, her religion, the specific decade she was living in, because the 1840s and the 1890s were not the same world even though we bundle them together under the word Victorian. Her own temperament, her fears, her habits, the particular configuration of her body's needs, the rituals she had inherited from her mother and her grandmother, and the advice books she had read, and the things her friends had told her in quiet voices about what helped and what didn't. All of it went into the night. Let's go into it together. The first thing she would do upon entering her bedroom, and this is the part that I keep finding myself returning to when I think about the Victorian night, was not undress. The undressing was coming, and it was a considerable undertaking, but it wasn't first. First she sat, or she stood at the window for a moment, or she moved around the room making the small preparatory adjustments that the room required, poking up the fire if one had been laid, checking that the water in the ewer had not gone completely cold, moving the candle to the dressing table where she would need it. This transitional moment, this brief pause between arriving in the room and beginning the serious work of the night, was something that comes up again and again in Victorian diaries and memoirs when women write about their evenings, not as a significant thing, not as something they considered remarkable, but as a natural breath before the work began. Charlotte Brontë, writing to her friend Ellen Nussey in the 1840s, described her evenings at Haworth Parsonage in ways that make the bedroom feel like the one reliable refuge in a day full of demands. After an evening of writing or reading or managing her father's household, she would go upstairs, and the going up had a meaning. It was a release, even when the night ahead was cold and her health was poor, and the loneliness of that house sat heavy on every room. Elizabeth Gaskell, writing fiction but clearly drawing on the texture of domestic life she observed around her, gave her women characters this same quality of provisional pause at the bedroom door, a moment of gathering themselves before the undoing. What I find interesting about this is that it tells you something about what the bedroom meant, that no domestic advice book quite says outright. It was not just a room for sleeping, it was a room for the unwinding of the self, and unwinding, as anyone who has tried to do it quickly knows, cannot actually be rushed. It requires its own kind of time. Now, the dressing table. Before anything else comes off, before a single button is touched, the Victorian woman with any claim to a proper night routine sat down at her dressing table. The dressing table was one of the defining pieces of furniture of the Victorian bedroom, and it meant something beyond its practical function. It had a mirror, in the better sort of household, a triple glass arrangement that allowed a woman to see the back of her own head, which was useful given how much Victorian hairstyling happened at the back of the head. It had a surface covered usually in white linen or muslin, a dressing table cover that was laundered and changed regularly, and that served partly as protection for the table's surface, and partly as an expression of the household standards of cleanliness. On it sat an array of objects that in their own quiet way constituted a whole small world. The hairpin dish, often ceramic, often with a decorative pattern, because this was the Victorians and they decorated everything. The candle or oil lamp, the latter becoming more common as the century progressed. The hand mirror, the clothes brush, the small scissors for snipping thread from mended items, the comb and the brush, which we will spend considerable time with in a moment, and then the bottles, the jars, the small ceramic pots and glass containers with their ground glass stoppers, the cold cream, the rose water, the glycerin, the lavender water, the almond oil, the camphor, the elderflower water, the cucumber milk. Each one represented a specific step in the process of nightly skincare, which in the Victorian era was remarkably sophisticated, built on generations of accumulated domestic knowledge and the particular Victorian conviction that the skin, like everything else in life, required careful management to stay respectable. She would sit down at the dressing table, and the reflection that met her there was worth a moment of acknowledgement, because it was the face without the performance, the hair still up, for now. The colour of her cheeks genuine rather than carefully tended, or perhaps rather paler than the day's exertions had left it. The eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with what was socially acceptable to show. For some women this was a difficult moment. There is a quality of reckoning in seeing yourself honestly after a full day, and Victorian women were no more or less spared from that than anyone else. The difference was that many of them had been taught a particular relationship to that mirror, one in which what you saw was either a problem to be addressed or a small blessing to be grateful for, but never simply a neutral fact about yourself. For others, the dressing table mirror was genuinely comforting, a familiar face, a reliable presence, evidence that you had made it through another day and were, for the moment, still here. Before we get to what happened at the dressing table in any detail, there is something we need to understand about Victorian hair, because Victorian hair governed the entire rhythm of the night routine in ways that are easy to underestimate. Victorian women had long hair. This was not merely the fashion, though it was certainly the fashion. It was also the social norm, the moral norm in some quarters, and the practical given of a world where hair was not something you cut simply because it was convenient. Cutting a woman's hair short was associated with illness or grief or, in the harsher registers of Victorian social judgment, with a certain kind of disreputable modernity that respectable women kept at a careful distance. Long hair, meaning hair that fell at least to the shoulders and commonly to the waist or beyond, required management, daily, nightly, seasonal management. It required pinning and braiding and oiling and brushing, and the specific Victorian category of care known as dressing, which meant arranging the hair in the elaborate styles that the era demanded and that required significant time and skill, whether you did them yourself or had someone do them for you. During the day, a Victorian woman's hair was up. This is almost universal for adult women throughout most of the Victorian period, with some variations in exactly how and with a loosening toward the end of the century that allowed for rather more swept back and softly arranged styles than the severe central parts and tightly coiled buns of the 1840s and 1850s. But up, secured, controlled. The act of taking the hair down at night was therefore not nothing. It was one of the genuinely physical reliefs of the evening. Dozens of pins, sometimes literally dozens, 30, 40, even more, in the more elaborate daytime styles, had been pressing against the scalp all day. The weight of all that hair, held up by the architecture of those pins, put a particular strain on the neck and the back of the head that you would feel as a low-grade ache by the end of the day. And then you sat down at the dressing table, and the pins came out one by one, placed into the pin dish with a series of small metallic sounds, and the hair came down. There is a letter written by a woman named Catherine in the 1870s, preserved in a collection of domestic correspondence at a regional archive in the north of England, in which she describes this specific moment with a warmth that rather surprised the historian who first quoted it. She writes to her sister, "You will laugh at me for saying so, but the moment each evening when I remove the last pin and feel my hair fall is the one moment of the day that is entirely mine. I cannot explain why. John is still downstairs. The children have not yet settled. The house is not quiet. But that moment, that particular loosening, feels like something I cannot share and do not need to. I do not laugh at her for saying so. I think she is describing something true. The unpinning of the hair was a private ceremony of release, and the fact that it happened at a dressing table, in a mirror, alone, gave it a quality of self-witnessing that the rest of the day simply did not provide. Now the hair, once down, did not simply hang there waiting to be dealt with. There was a sequence. The comb came first. This was not the elegant ivory comb that sat decoratively on the dressing table surface. The working comb was wider-toothed, practical, sometimes made of vulcanized rubber or of horn, and it began at the ends of the hair and worked upward. Downward combing through tangled Victorian hair would have been rather destructive. The ends first. Work out the knots gently. Move upward incrementally. This technique, which feels so obviously sensible to anyone who has ever had long hair, is actually documented in a surprising number of Victorian hair care manuals as something that needed to be specifically taught, which tells you that there were plenty of women who were doing it the painful and damaging other way. The comb pass took perhaps 5 minutes, then the brush. The 100 strokes. This is the thing you may have heard about, and if you have heard about it, you may have dismissed it as Victorian folk wisdom without particular basis. But here is where the story gets interesting, because the 100 strokes was not quite the superstition it sounds. The boar bristle brush, and these were genuinely bristles from boar hogs, not synthetic fibers, which did not exist in any useful form until considerably later, had a particular quality. The bristles were made of keratin, the same protein that makes up human hair. When dragged from the scalp through the full length of the hair, this bristle carried the sebum, the natural oil produced by the scalp, down through the hair shaft from root to end. It distributed what the scalp was already making. For women who were not washing their hair every day, which for most of the Victorian era meant most women, this distribution was genuinely important. Victorian hair washing was complicated. The water had to be heated. The drying was slow and cold and involved elaborate wrapping of flannel around the head. The soaps available, often based on Castile or curd soap, were quite harsh by modern standards. Hair washing was a significant undertaking that happened, for most women, perhaps once a week, perhaps once every 2 weeks, and in some households only once a month. Between washings, the 100 strokes were what kept the hair manageable. They spread the oil, they cleaned away surface dust, they removed the loose hairs that accumulated through the day, and, this is the part the Victorians understood, but could not have explained scientifically, they stimulated the blood circulation to the scalp, which promoted the production of that same oil and contributed to the overall health of the hair. There is an 1876 Ladies' Health Manual that describes the effect as follows. A thorough brushing will leave the hair with that particular smooth brilliancy which no artificial dressing can replicate, and which is the reward of patience and consistency. The language of reward and virtue is very Victorian, but the underlying observation is not wrong. What I find worth sitting with for a moment is the quality of attention that 100 brush strokes actually requires. Not rushed, not aggressive, deliberate. Each stroke firm enough to be effective, gentle enough not to break the hair. Starting at the scalp, drawing down through the full length. 1, 2, 3. Some women counted, others did not, having long since developed an instinctive sense of when enough was enough. Some had a maid to do it for them. We will talk about the maid's role in this whole process considerably. And some did it themselves, 20 minutes perhaps, for the full brushing of long Victorian hair. 20 minutes of sitting still, of looking at oneself in a mirror, of nothing happening except this one rhythmic, careful, purposeful act. In a life as structured and observed and performed as a Victorian woman's life, 20 minutes of this was not nothing. It was, I would argue, the closest thing to meditation that Victorian domesticity routinely allowed. The braiding or plaiting that followed the brushing was practical before it was anything else. Long hair left loose during sleep tangled catastrophically. The pillow created friction against the hair shaft. Rolling over in the night created knots that could take a considerable amount of time and some discomfort to work out the following morning. Long hair needed to be secured for sleeping, and the braid was the standard solution. One long loose braid down the back was the most common arrangement. Not tight, that created its own problems, pulling at the scalp through the night, but firm enough to hold. Tied with a ribbon or a piece of tape at the end, Nothing fancy, just sufficient. Some women plaited their hair over one shoulder rather than straight down the back, which they found more comfortable when sleeping on their side, which most people do. Some used two plaits for particularly thick or heavy hair. Some secured the braid further by wrapping it loosely around the head and pinning it, a kind of miniature night arrangement that kept the length from dragging uncomfortably. In households with a lady's maid, the maid did the braiding as part of the nightly routine. In households without one, which was the majority, the woman did it herself, arms up and behind her head, working quickly and efficiently with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this specific action essentially every evening of her adult life. The braid was mundane. It was practical, and it was the last act before the hair was truly settled for the night, at which point a nightcap might go on. We'll get to nightcaps in a little while, and the hair was more or less finished with until morning. But before we leave the dressing table entirely, let us talk about the skin, because Victorian women thought about their skin considerably, and what they thought and what they did about it is a story worth telling fully. The Victorian complexion was a moral and social category as much as a physical one. Pale skin was desirable, not merely as a fashion preference, but as a class marker. It indicated that you did not work outdoors, that you were not a labourer, that your life was conducted in interior spaces. A tanned or weathered complexion in the middle-class Victorian imagination signalled a rougher kind of life than a respectable woman was supposed to lead. This put an enormous amount of pressure on skin care, because maintaining what the beauty manuals called a good complexion required consistent, daily attention. The most important item in the Victorian woman's nighttime skincare routine was cold cream. Cold cream in the Victorian era was quite similar to cold cream now, a mixture of beeswax or spermaceti wax, oil and rosewater, whipped together into a pale, smooth, faintly fragrant cream that melted pleasantly against warm skin. Some women bought it from the apothecary or from one of the growing number of Victorian beauty suppliers. Others made it at home from a recipe that appeared in essentially every Victorian household management book in some form. The purpose of cold cream at night was primarily cleansing, removing the day's accumulated grime from the face and neck, which in Victorian cities meant coal smoke and street dust, and the general particulate matter of the urban Victorian air, which was rather more substantial than anything we experience today. But it was also moisturizing, because winter air and coal fires both dried the skin considerably, and the oils in the cream helped restore some of what the day had taken away. The application was specific. You did not slap it on carelessly. Victorian beauty manuals were emphatic about this. The cream went on with the fingertips, in small circular movements, working from the center of the face outward. The neck received it in upward strokes. Downward was considered less effective and possibly counterproductive, an early expression of what we would now call massage direction. The décolletage, if visible skin extended there, might receive attention as well. After a few minutes, the manuals suggest 3 to 5, the cream was removed with a soft cloth or with a piece of fine linen, not wiped off aggressively, but pressed gently, then lifted away, taking with it the dissolved surface grime and the excess cream. What was left on the skin was not much, just a slight residue of oil and warmth, and maybe a faint smell of rosewater, but it was enough to feel distinctly different from uncreamed skin. Softer, less exposed, ready for the night in a way that the day's skin had not been. Rosewater appears so often in Victorian skincare routines that it deserves its own moment of attention. Rosewater is what it sounds like, water distilled from rose petals, or in cheaper preparations, simply scented with rose essence. It had been used in European cosmetics and medicine since at least the medieval period, and by the Victorian era it was ubiquitous. Every apothecary sold it, every housekeeping manual referenced it. It appeared in recipes for skin toner, for eye washes, for hair rinses, for mouthwashes, for headache remedies, and occasionally in cooking, though that was considered slightly outmoded by the mid-Victorian period. As a skin toner it was applied after cleansing with a cotton wool pad or a soft cloth. Cotton wool being one of those Victorian inventions that we take completely for granted and that was actually quite new in the mid-19th century. The rosewater removed any remaining traces of cleanser and left the skin slightly tightened, slightly refreshed. It smelled wonderful. This was not an incidental benefit. The smell of rosewater in a Victorian bedroom at night was part of the texture of the space, part of what made it feel like a place of care rather than mere function. Some women added glycerin to their rosewater, in a proportion of perhaps 1 part glycerin to 8 or 10 parts rosewater. Glycerin, a thick, slightly viscous liquid produced as a byproduct of soap manufacture, had been recognized as a skin humectant by the Victorian era, meaning it drew moisture from the air into the skin. A glycerin and rosewater preparation was one of the most effective moisturizing treatments available in an era before modern cosmetic chemistry, and the fact that women were using it suggests a pragmatic, observational intelligence about what their skin actually responded to. Elderflower water was another common toner, made from the distilled flowers of the elder tree and thought to be particularly good for fair or sensitive skin. Cucumber milk, the juice pressed from fresh cucumbers, sometimes diluted with milk or with water, appeared frequently in home remedy books as something you could make yourself in summer when cucumbers were available and use through the winter months. The idea that cucumber was soothing and cooling to inflamed or tired skin is not Victorian superstition. It has some genuine basis in the chemistry of cucumber juice, which contains mild anti-inflammatory compounds. Lemon juice appears in numerous Victorian preparations as a brightening agent and light bleaching treatment for skin that had developed spots or uneven pigmentation. This is essentially correct in the sense that the citric acid in lemon juice does have some lightening effect on dark spots. Though used undiluted, it could also be quite irritating, and the Victorian beauty books are curiously silent on this potential downside. What I find genuinely striking about Victorian nighttime skincare when you lay it all out is how thoughtful it was. These were not women applying random substances to their faces out of vanity or superstition. They had a consistent, layered approach: cleanse, tone, moisturize, that matches the structure of modern skincare in its basic logic, if not always in its specific chemistry. The knowledge was empirical and inherited, passed from mother to daughter, adjusted by personal experience, refined by the advice of friends, and the contents of the household management books that Victorian women read and consulted with the serious attention they gave to anything that bore on the proper running of their lives and bodies. There was also, of course, the dangerous side of Victorian beauty. We would be telling only part of the story to skip it, and we should address it, not at length and not with shock value, but honestly. Some Victorian women used preparations containing lead or mercury as skin lighteners and complexion refiners. The lead carbonate in white lead cosmetics, face powder, certain creams, had a genuine lightening effect on the skin and gave it a smooth, matte appearance that was considered desirable. The mercury in some skin bleaching preparations reduced pigmentation. Both substances were also, as we now know definitively, and as some Victorian physicians were beginning to suspect, poisonous. Accumulated use could cause neurological damage, kidney damage, and worse. The ordinary middle-class Victorian woman, doing her nightly skincare routine at her dressing table, was probably not using these dangerous preparations routinely. They were more associated with theatrical or fashion-conscious circles, and with women who felt particular social pressure around their appearance, but they existed in the marketplace. They were marketed without full disclosure of their risks, and they caused real harm. It is worth naming this not to shame the Victorian era, but because it is part of the honest picture, and because the impulse that drove women toward those preparations, the social pressure to look a particular way, the fear of falling short of an appearance standard that was never designed with their health in mind, is not a Victorian problem that we have neatly solved. The undressing. We have arrived, finally, at the undressing, and it is going to take a while, because Victorian women's clothing was itself a considerable undertaking. Let me first give you a sense of what a middle-class Victorian woman was wearing when she entered her bedroom in, say, the 1870s or 1880s. We are talking about the mature Victorian era here, the era that most people picture when they think Victorian, not the crinoline of the 1850s and early 1860s, which was its own magnificent absurdity, but the bustle period, and then the more streamlined silhouette of the later 1880s into the 1890s. The basic architecture of dress was similar throughout. Starting from the outside and working inward, the dress itself. In the evening, this might be a dinner or visiting gown of silk or merino wool or lighter fabric depending on the season, or for a quieter evening at home, a simpler tea gown or house dress that was less elaborate than formal day dress. Regardless of its specific form, the dress had buttons, many buttons, down the back, frequently, which is going to become relevant in a moment, along the cuffs, sometimes at the collar. Some dresses had hooks and eyes rather than buttons, some had both. A typical Victorian bodice might have 15 to 20 fastenings at the back alone. Underneath the dress, a bodice or corset cover, a light cotton garment worn over the corset to protect the outer dress from the corset's seams and bones, and to present a smooth surface beneath the dress fabric, the corset. We will spend a great deal of time with the corset, because it deserves it. But note for now, it was present. It had laces at the back, and it required 2 hands to properly adjust or remove. Beneath the corset, the chemise or shift, a loose-fitting garment of white cotton or fine linen that lay directly against the skin and served to absorb perspiration, protect the corset from body oils, and provide a layer of modesty beneath everything, the petticoats. In the 1870s and 1880s, this typically meant a bustle arrangement at the back, a pad or small wire frame that created the characteristic silhouette of the period, plus 1 or more petticoats of varying weight depending on the season. Stockings, held up by garters or by the stocking supporters attached to the lower edge of the corset in later decades. Drawers, split at the center seam in a design that remained standard through much of the Victorian period, practical in a world without running water or convenient bathroom access, but confusing to modern eyes when encountered in museum collections. That is 7 separate layers, some of them with numerous fastenings each. And then there were the shoes, buttoned boots typically, with a button hook, which was a small hooked tool that allowed you to fasten a row of tiny leather buttons without requiring the impossible finger dexterity that doing it directly would demand. Now, in households with a lady's maid, many of these fastenings were not the woman's immediate concern. The lady's maid dressed and undressed her mistress as part of the day's established duties. This was not a luxury in the Victorian understanding of it. It was a practical necessity, because some of these fastenings genuinely could not be managed alone, particularly the back buttons of the bodice and the corset laces. A woman trying to lace her own corset from the back was working blind and at full arm extension, and the result was inevitably less neat, less even, and less effective than the work of a second pair of hands. But many middle-class Victorian women did not have a lady's maid. A cook and a housemaid, perhaps, maybe only a single general servant, a young woman who came each day and went home in the evening. In these households, the woman managed her own undressing as best she could. This was why Victorian dress designers, whatever their artistic intentions, were also constrained by the practical realities of self-management. Some fastenings were designed to be managed from the front. Some corsets were made with a front-opening busk, a hinged or stud and loop fastening at the center front, which meant that once the back laces were loosened, the corset could be opened from the front without assistance. This was a practical concession to the lived reality of women who needed to dress and undress themselves. Let me walk you through what the undressing looked like in something close to real time, because I think the detail matters. She sits at the dressing table first, as we said, for the hair and the face. Then she moves to stand, or perhaps to sit on the edge of the bed. The outer dress first, if there is someone to help with the back buttons, or perhaps a reverse sequence if she is alone, sitting down and reaching back for the easier fastenings before standing to step out of the skirt. The dress off, set aside or passed to a maid who will hang it, or brush it, or lay it over the clothes horse depending on its condition and whether it would be worn again before the next laundry day. The corset cover removed. Simple, this. It was designed to come off easily because it came off first when dressing too, so you needed access to the corset laces beneath it. And now the corset. The corset was the center of gravity of the Victorian night routine, in the same way that the hearth was the center of gravity of the colonial home. Everything radiated outward from it, everything was shaped by it, and the act of removing it was the most significant physical event of the evening. Let us talk about the corset honestly, because it has been so much mythologized and so much misunderstood that the truth about it can feel surprising. The Victorian corset was not primarily a torture device designed by patriarchy to punish women for having bodies. That narrative, while not entirely without basis, misses the much more complicated and much more human reality of what the corset actually was and how it was experienced by the women who wore it. The Victorian corset was a garment with a specific structural function. It created the fashionable silhouette of the era, the narrowed waist, the lifted bust, the smooth line from shoulder to hip that the period's aesthetic demanded. In this sense, it was a garment doing what all garments of all eras have done, which is to impose the period's visual ideal onto the body beneath it. But it was also for many women a form of back support. Women who wore corsets from adolescence, as was standard throughout much of the Victorian period, had bodies that had adapted to them. The muscles of the torso, not constantly called upon to maintain posture without the corset's assistance, were often less strong than they would be otherwise. This meant that for many Victorian women, wearing a well-fitted corset was genuinely more comfortable during a long day of standing and moving than going without one would have been. The corset held the back. It distributed the weight of the petticoats and dress around the waist, rather than letting it hang entirely from the shoulders. There is a letter from a woman named Margaret, written in the 1880s and quoted in a history of Victorian dress, published in the 1980s, in which she describes the experience of staying for a week in the country and, at her hostess's encouragement, adopting a looser, less structured style of dress for morning activities. By Thursday I found the freedom rather fatiguing than otherwise, she writes, and returned to my ordinary stays with a sensation not unlike relief. The word stays means corset here. It was the more common term for much of the Victorian period, and the relief she describes is the relief of restored support rather than the relief of a garment removed. This does not mean the corset was uniformly comfortable or that all women wore it with equanimity. Tight lacing, the practice of lacing the corset more severely than normal to achieve a fashionably small waist, a practice popularized by fashion plates and by certain women who pursued it as a genuine aesthetic commitment, caused real physical problems: compressed ribs, displaced organs, labored breathing. The physicians of the Victorian era complained about tight lacing with some frequency, and not without reason. The most extreme forms of it caused genuine harm, but tight lacing was a fashion for some women, practiced deliberately and not universal. The ordinary middle-class Victorian woman in her ordinary household, wearing her stays at the degree of tightness considered comfortable rather than extreme, was doing something rather different from the tight-lacing fashion plate. What is almost universally true is that when the corset came off in the evening, after a full day of wearing it, the sensation of release was remarkable. The rib cage expanded to its full natural extent, the diaphragm dropped. The breath that followed was qualitatively different from any breath taken while corseted, not dramatically so, not like surfacing from underwater, but noticeably pleasantly different. The body remembered suddenly what unconstrained breathing felt like, and that remembering, repeated every single evening of an adult Victorian woman's life, must have been one of the more consistent and reliable physical pleasures of the day. The corset, removed, was placed over the towel horse or the back of a chair to air overnight, which was important for hygiene because the cotton or cutel fabric had absorbed a day's worth of perspiration. In the morning it would be checked, perhaps smoothed, perhaps lightly touched with a damp cloth if a particular spot required it, and put back on. Corsets were not laundered frequently because the washing was hard on the stiffened structure, the bones and the cutel fabric. They were aired instead. Regular airing was considered adequate for hygiene, and by the standards of the era it probably was, given that the chemise underneath was providing a washable barrier between the corset and the skin. The chemise or shift, that innermost garment, was a different matter from the corset when it came to care. This was the garment that touched skin directly all day, and it was changed more frequently, daily ideally, in households where laundry was managed regularly. In a well-run Victorian household, the accumulation and laundering of household linens was one of the major organizational undertakings of the week, and the women's chemises were part of that cycle. Putting on the nightgown, the night dress in the language of the period, was the final stage of the undressing, or rather the transition between undressed and properly dressed for sleep. Because going to bed in the Victorian era did not mean going to bed undressed. That was not considered appropriate even in complete privacy. Even alone, even unobserved, a Victorian woman was expected to be covered. The nightgown provided that cover. Victorian nightgowns were long, floor-length or very nearly so, white, almost universally, though the exact shade varied from the bleached brilliance of fine cambric to the softer cream of less expensive cotton or flannel for winter. Long sleeves as a rule, though shorter summer versions existed. High-necked, typically, with perhaps a small frill at the collar and cuffs, or with the collar fastened by a single button or tied with a ribbon. Nothing elaborate, not compared to the day dress, but something that said, "You are covered, and the fact of your covering is not incidental." The quality of the nightgown varied dramatically by the household's wealth. In the trousseau, the collection of household linens and personal clothing assembled by a woman before marriage, the nightgowns were often among the finest items. Hand-sewn, trimmed with broderie anglaise or Valenciennes lace, embroidered with the woman's initials or a small motif at the chest. These were garments intended to last for years and to be treated with care. The nightgowns of a working-class woman or a woman of genuinely limited means were more prosaic, plain cotton, minimal trim, functional above all. But even the plainest nightgown served the same essential function. It was the garment of the private self, the one thing worn in the most private space of the most private room, and in the Victorian framework where clothes were not merely coverings but indicators of a whole moral and social condition, even the quality and cleanliness of your nightgown, seen only by yourself and perhaps by your husband and your maid, carried a kind of significance that we might not quite understand. If there was a lady's maid, she was present through much of this. Let us pause and give her proper attention, because her role in the Victorian night routine is not incidental to the story, it is central to it. The lady's maid was a specific category of servant in the Victorian domestic hierarchy. She was not the housemaid who cleaned. She was not the cook. She occupied a curious intermediate position in the household, closer to the mistress than any other servant, privy to the most intimate details of her daily life, trusted with access to the most private spaces, and yet entirely of a different class, entirely dependent on the mistress's goodwill and circumstances. A good lady's maid was trained in specific skills, dressing hair, caring for fine clothing, mending delicate fabrics, making minor alterations to garments, preparing simple cosmetic preparations from household receipts, and managing the mistress's wardrobe with the kind of organizational intelligence that kept things running smoothly. She knew which dress had a loose hook that needed catching before it tore the fabric below it. She knew that her mistress preferred the rosewater at a certain dilution and that the cold cream from the particular supplier on a particular street was better than the one from the rival establishment. She knew the mistress's body, its proportions, its sensitivities, the particular tension in the neck after a difficult day, with an intimacy that no one else in the household shared. Hannah Culwick, who worked as a maidservant in various Victorian households from the 1840s through the 1870s, and who kept an extraordinary diary recording the details of that life, wrote about the particular closeness of the lady's maid role, with something between appreciation and a kind of quiet philosophical observation. She noted that the relationship between a woman and her personal maid was unlike any other relationship in the household. Not friendship. The class gulf made that impossible in any meaningful sense, but something not entirely captured by the word service either. Something that lived in the intimate, repeated, physical attention of one woman to another, in the daily touching and seeing and managing that the role required. The maid helped with the back buttons. She loosened the corset laces. She brushed the hair, those 100 strokes, while the mistress sat still and perhaps spoke, or perhaps did not speak. She brought the warm water for the face washing. She laid out the nightgown over the fire tender or on the clothes horse to warm it slightly before it was put on, which was a small luxury that felt considerably larger in a cold Victorian bedroom in January. She turned down the bed and smoothed the sheets. She might bring up a warming pan, a flat metal pan with a long handle that had been filled with coals from the kitchen fire, and run it carefully between the sheets to take the chill off the linen on a cold night. And then she left, quietly, efficiently, taking with her the day clothes that needed attention, closing the bedroom door behind her, going back downstairs or up to her own quarters in the attic, or the back of the house to begin her own abbreviated version of the night routine in whatever time was left before she needed to be awake again in the morning. The asymmetry of that exchange is worth holding in mind as we continue. The mistress, properly undressed and tucked in and warmed, had hours of private night ahead of her. The maid, who had been at work since 6 or 7 in the morning, had her own cold, narrow bed in a considerably less comfortable room waiting for her, and an early start the next day regardless of when she finally got there. The bed itself deserved description, because the Victorian bed was a remarkable piece of engineering. The grand Victorian bed, the kind you see in house museums and period dramas, was a 4-poster or half-tester design, a tall structure of mahogany or walnut or iron, with hangings of heavy fabric around 3 or all 4 sides. The hangings served several practical purposes. They created a smaller, warmer enclosed space within the larger, colder bedroom. They offered privacy and shared sleeping spaces. They blocked drafts from the windows, which in Victorian homes before proper weatherproofing were often considerable. They were also incidentally very expensive and very difficult to clean, and by the later Victorian period, the fashion was moving away from them towards simpler iron bedsteads that were considered more hygienic and certainly easier to manage. The mattress situation in a Victorian bed was layered and complex. The base was usually a horsehair mattress, tightly packed fibre giving a firm foundation. Atop this sat a feather or flock mattress, softer, which was the actual sleeping surface for most of the night. The sheets, white linen ideally, or cotton in less affluent households, were tucked in with hospital corners at the base, smoothed tight across the top, and turned back over a wool blanket. Additional blankets were available depending on the season, and in winter, especially in bedrooms where the fire was allowed to die down through the night, rather than being kept at full heat, these additional blankets might be considerable. Pillows in the Victorian era were larger and flatter than modern pillows as a rule. 2 was standard, feather-filled, covered in white cotton pillowcases that were laundered with the sheets. In wealthier households, the pillowcases might have drawn thread or embroidered borders. In ordinary households, they were plain white cotton, clean and crisp after wash day. To sleep in a properly made Victorian bed in a properly prepared Victorian bedroom was, by the accounts of those who did it, a genuine physical pleasure. The warmth of the enclosed space, the weight of the blankets, the slight give of the mattress layers, the smell of clean linen. Victorian domestic advice writers were quite eloquent about the bed as an experience, about sleep as something that a well-kept household prepared for and created conditions for, not just something that happened accidentally when the body gave out. Mrs. Beeton, whose book of household management published in 1861 became the reference text for aspiring middle-class Victorian housekeeping, included specific instructions about bed-making and about the conditions conducive to healthful sleep that read with a clarity and conviction, suggesting she considered the matter genuinely important. The bedroom should be well aired, the bed linen should be changed regularly, the room should not be overheated. Adequate ventilation was essential. The ventilation question is interesting. Victorian physicians were divided on the subject of night air. One school held that night air was inherently dangerous, damp, miasmatic, threatening to the lungs, and recommended keeping bedroom windows closed. Another, increasingly dominant school through the latter half of the century, argued exactly the opposite, that fresh air through the night was essential to healthy sleep, that the stale air of a closed bedroom was more dangerous than any winter cold. The debate runs through Victorian medical literature with a vigour that is mildly comic from a modern perspective, but it was genuinely contested, and it affected how Victorian women prepared their bedrooms for the night. Many women, following the fresh air school, left their bedroom window open a crack regardless of the season. Some put screens over the window to prevent insects while allowing air. Others, particularly those in urban areas where the air outside the window was coal smoke and street filth rather than anything pastoral, kept their windows closed and relied on the fireplace for air movement. Now, the nightcap. I want to spend a moment on the nightcap because it is one of those items from history that has been reduced to comic prop status, the floppy cotton thing on Scrooge's head, when the reality of it was rather different. Nightcaps for women in the Victorian era were still common through the earlier decades, gradually becoming less so toward the end of the century. They were made of fine white cotton, or of muslin, or occasionally of silk for the more luxurious end of the market. They were cap-shaped in an obvious sense, fitting loosely over the top of the head with strings or ribbon to tie under the chin. They might be plain, they might be trimmed with lace or broderie anglaise, because the Victorians trimmed everything with lace when they had the opportunity. The nightcap's functions were practical. It kept the head warm. The head loses heat disproportionately during sleep, and in a bedroom that was allowed to cool significantly through the night, a head covering was not a trivial comfort. It protected the hair, already braided, from further tangling against the pillow. It absorbed any oils or lotions applied to the scalp or the hairline before sleep, and it was simply conventional, something that a respectable woman wore to bed because respectable women wore nightcaps to bed. By the 1870s and 1880s, the nightcap was beginning to feel old-fashioned to younger, more fashion-conscious women, and by the 1890s it was largely obsolete for the under-40 generation. Older women and women in more conservative households continued wearing them later. The nightcap's decline is a small marker of the broader shift in Victorian domestic culture that happened across the second half of the century. A shift toward greater simplicity in private domestic arrangements, a loosening of the more rigid formal structures of earlier decades. A bed jacket, however, remained in use. The bed jacket was a short upper garment, usually quilted or made of warm flannel, worn over the nightgown when sitting up in bed. It reached the waist or a little below. It was fastened with buttons or ties at the front. In winter, when a Victorian woman sat up in bed to read, as many did, before finally settling to sleep, the bed jacket provided the warmth that the nightgown alone could not, given that the upper body was above the blankets and therefore exposed to the cooled air of the room. Bed jackets were things of varying elegance, a plain flannel one for ordinary nights, a quilted silk or satin one for being seen in, because you might receive a caller in your bedroom if you were unwell, you might need to speak with your maid, you might have your husband or children in the room before sleep. Looking appropriately covered and composed in those contexts required something more than a plain nightgown. Let us talk about what happened after the physical rituals of undressing and preparation were complete. After the hair was braided and the skin was creamed and the corset was hung to air and the nightgown was on and the warming pan had done its work and the maid had left and the bedroom door was closed. The quiet part, the private hours, Victorian women read in bed. This is perhaps the aspect of their night routines that feels most familiar to modern sensibilities. Reading in bed, by candlelight, or later by the light of an oil lamp, or eventually a gas light, was a common practice among literate middle-class women throughout the Victorian era. What they read varied enormously. Novels were the great Victorian reading pleasure. The novel was the dominant literary form of the era, and the serial novel in particular, published in monthly or weekly installments in magazines and then gathered into volume form, structured the reading life of many Victorians in ways that feel recognizably modern. You waited for the next installment. You discussed it with friends. You had opinions. The works of Dickens, Thackeray, Eliot, Trollope, Wilkie Collins, Mrs. Gaskell, these were not merely books. They were cultural events, discussed in drawing rooms and exchanged in lending libraries and read by lamplight in bedrooms across the country. But bedtime reading in the Victorian household also had a religious dimension that reading before sleep does not typically carry for us. Many women read from the Bible in the evening as a devotional practice. This was not necessarily the formal, structured family prayers that might have happened downstairs earlier in the evening. This was a private, individual act of faith, a chapter of scripture, a passage from a devotional commentary, perhaps a few pages from one of the many religious works that Victorian publishing houses produced in enormous quantities. The devotional reading served as a kind of mental preparation for sleep in its own particular way. It turned the mind away from the immediate concerns of the day, the social anxieties, the household worries, the small and large difficulties that accumulated over a full day of managing a life, and towards something larger and quieter. Whether or not modern readers share the faith that made this practice meaningful, the psychological function of it is recognizable, turning the mind from the specific to the general, from the anxious to the contemplative, from the noise of the day to something that felt like stillness. Charlotte Brontë wrote to Ellen Nussey in 1840 of her habit of reading until she became too sleepy to continue, and described the particular pleasure of a book that was compelling enough to keep her awake past midnight. This was a guilty pleasure in her construction. She notes that she knew she should sleep earlier, but it was clearly not one she intended to give up. The book and the candle and the cold room and the privacy of the night were a combination she valued too much. Catherine Gladstone, wife of William Ewart Gladstone, and a woman of considerable intelligence and energy who managed one of the most demanding political households in Victorian England, is recorded as keeping a regular bedtime reading habit even during the most intense periods of parliamentary session. What she read in those hours is not always documented, but the practice of reading before sleep is consistent across her diaries. Magazines were another common bedtime companion. The Victorian era was the great age of the periodical, and magazines addressed specifically to women. Godey's Lady's Book, The Lady's Treasury, the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine, among others, provided a mixture of fiction, household advice, fashion plates, and general interest articles that constituted something quite like the category of women's magazines that persist today. Reading a magazine in bed had a lighter, more desultory quality than reading a novel. You could set it down after a page or two without losing the thread of anything, which made it particularly suited to the gradual drift towards sleep. Prayer. We cannot talk about a Victorian woman's night without talking about prayer, because for the majority of Victorian women, prayer was not incidental to the night routine. It was structural to it. It was, in the religious understanding of the era, the purpose of the night in a deeper sense than anything the body required. Victorian religious culture was not uniform. It encompassed a broad range of denominations, from High Church Anglicanism, with its formal liturgical structures, to the more emotionally immediate and personally intimate forms of nonconformist worship that had spread widely through the middle classes during the first half of the century. The specific forms of nightly prayer varied accordingly. For Anglican women who followed the Book of Common Prayer, evening prayer, evensong in its formal setting, evening devotion in its domestic practice, provided a structured format for the night's religious observances. The general confession, the Lord's Prayer, the specific collects appointed for evening use. These were not invented anew each night. They were inherited, memorized, repeated. The repetition was not meaningless. In the Anglican theological framework, the repeated saying of established prayers was an act of participation in something larger than individual feeling, a joining of one's voice to a tradition of prayer that stretched back through the whole history of the Church. For nonconformist women, Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, the nightly prayer was more likely to be personal and extemporaneous. You did not follow a set form. You spoke in your own words, privately, to a God you understood as immediately present and personally attentive. You said what was on your mind. You gave thanks for what had been good about the day. You brought forward what had been difficult. You asked for what you needed and for what the people you loved needed. What is consistent across both forms and across the considerable denominational variation within Victorian Protestant practice is the act of review that the night prayer represented. Looking back over the day, naming what had happened, finding the shape of it in relation to something larger than the immediate moment. There is something psychologically intelligent about this practice, even entirely stripped of its theological meaning. The act of briefly reviewing a day before sleep, not to ruminate, not to catastrophize, but to name and then release, is something that contemporary therapeutic practice occasionally recommends in different language. The Victorians came to it through faith, but the function it served in the night routine is recognizable across a considerable distance. Personal diaries served a related purpose, and keeping a diary was standard practice for many middle-class Victorian women. Not a diary in the modern sense necessarily, not an introspective, psychologically exploratory document, often more practical, a record of visitors received, letters written, weather noted, household events documented. But woven through the practicalities were moments of genuine reflection, a note about how something had felt, a brief comment on a relationship, a recording of something read or heard that had lodged in the mind. The diary was the place where the inner life of the day was given just enough form to be set down, and by being set down, released a little. Writing by candlelight in a Victorian bedroom was a small act of authorship. The letter you wrote would be read by someone tomorrow. The diary entry would be read by you again someday, or not. Many Victorian diaries were never intended for other eyes. Either way, the act of writing required gathering thoughts into sentences, and sentences into some kind of order, and that ordering process had its own calming effect. You had made sense briefly of something, you had committed it to paper. The day was more finished than it had been before you began. The medicine cupboard, the nighttime remedies. Victorian women were deeply attentive to health, their own health, their children's health, their husband's health, the health of the servants in their care. This attention was practical necessity rather than hypochondria. Victorian medicine, even in its more advanced later century forms, was significantly less effective at treating most conditions than modern medicine, and the available preventive measures, good food, rest, fresh air, warmth, were in large part the domain of the household rather than the physician. The bedroom medicine chest, a small locked box or cabinet containing the household's medicinal supplies, was a standard feature of Victorian domestic life, and its contents varied considerably by the household's wealth, location, and specific health history. For sleep specifically, there was a range of Victorian remedies. The simplest and most innocuous was a hot drink. Warm milk was standard. The casein in milk has mild sedative properties, and the warmth was simply comforting. Some women added honey to their warm milk, or a small amount of brandy. Beef tea, a very light broth made by steeping lean beef in hot water, was recommended for restless evenings, and particularly for women who were unwell or recovering from illness. Chamomile tea had been in use as a calming preparation for centuries by the Victorian era, and chamomile grown in the garden or purchased dried from the apothecary was a standard household resource. For more significant insomnia, the Victorian medicine cupboard might contain laudanum, tincture of opium in alcohol, which is essentially what laudanum was, or one of the patent medicines containing opium derivatives that was sold throughout much of the Victorian era without prescription and without full disclosure of their contents. The danger of these preparations was real, and the Victorian era contains a disturbing number of documented cases of women who became dependent on laudanum, often having begun taking it on medical advice for pain or sleeplessness. The physicians who prescribed it were not villains. They were working within the pharmacological understanding of their time, but the harm was genuine. Chloral hydrate, a sedative synthesized in the 1860s and used widely from that decade forward, was the first genuinely effective sleep drug available to Victorian medicine. It worked. It also had risks, dependency, dangerous interactions with alcohol, and at high doses toxicity. Victorian physicians prescribed it for insomnia with some frequency, and it appeared in many household medicine cabinets. The plant-based remedies were safer, if less reliably effective. Valerian root, which has some genuine mild sedative properties confirmed by modern pharmacology, was used in tincture form. Hops, the same hops used in brewing, were recommended as a sleep aid in both tea form and in the hot pillows that appeared in Victorian home remedy books. Small cloth bags filled with dried hops and placed inside or near the pillowcase, the theory being that the volatile compounds released by the hops would promote sleep. Whether this worked is unclear. It certainly smelled interesting. Lavender, which appears in almost every Victorian sleep preparation in some form, had been associated with rest and calm since ancient times. Lavender sachets in the pillow, lavender water sprinkled on the bed linens, lavender oil rubbed onto the temples or the wrists. These were not effective in a pharmacological sense. Lavender's actual chemical properties are mild to the point of negligibility, but the psychological effect of a familiar scent associated from childhood with rest and safety and clean linens was not nothing. Scent and memory and mood are linked in ways that the Victorians intuited even without the neuroscience to explain it. The fire. In many Victorian bedrooms, particularly in the colder months, a fire burned in the bedroom grate through the evening hours. Not all night. Coal and wood were expensive, and an all-night bedroom fire was a luxury that most households extended only to the sick or to rooms where a new baby slept. But through the hours between retiring and sleeping, and sometimes for an hour or two after that, the bedroom fire was a presence. The bedroom fire was a different creature from the kitchen fire or the parlor fire. It was a private fire. It burned for one person or for two. It heated a small space rather than a large one, which made its warmth more immediate, more personal. And it gave light, that same shifting amber light that we talked about in the context of the colonial hearth, in a room that needed it for reading and for the final stages of the night routine. The coals in a Victorian bedroom grate, caught and held differently from wood, slower to start, longer burning, radiating a steady dry heat that dried the winter air somewhat but warmed the room reliably. The sound of the fire in a Victorian bedroom was described repeatedly in the literature of the period as conducive to rest. The periodic pop of coal, the gentle settling sound of the grate, the quality of quiet created by the fire's low, consistent sound. When sleep was imminent, the fire needed to be made safe. In households with a maid, this was her last act of the evening in the bedroom, banking the fire, securing the fireguard, ensuring the coals would not shift and spit during the night. In households without, the woman herself managed it. The fireguard, a spark guard of wire mesh fitted over the grate opening, was standard in Victorian bedrooms precisely because of the risk of overnight fires, which were a genuine hazard in houses full of cotton nightgowns and bed linens. The cooling of the bedroom after the fire was banked was something Victorian women accounted for in how they made the bed and how they dressed for sleep. The temperature in a Victorian bedroom in the hours before dawn in January, in a house heated only by a fireplace that had been banked before midnight, could be very cold indeed. The pile of blankets was not decorative excess, it was functional temperature management. Now I want to take you to the later evening, to the approaching of sleep itself, to what was happening in the mind and body of a Victorian woman as she settled toward rest. There is a particular quality of Victorian evening that comes through in the diaries and letters and memoirs of the period, and it is a quality of genuine tiredness. Not exhaustion exactly, not the bone-deep depletion of physical labor, though that existed too in households where the woman did considerable domestic work herself, but the specific tiredness of a life conducted at the level of social performance that Victorian middle-class life required. The Victorian woman was performing constantly. She performed competence, the well-run household, the correct social behavior, the appropriate management of every interaction. She performed femininity, the specific, regulated femininity that the era demanded, with its precise rules about bearing, appearance, speech, expression. She performed domestic happiness, the appearance of contentment, the presentation to the world of a home and a marriage and a family life that conformed to the ideals of Victorian domestic ideology. None of this is to say that Victorian women were not sometimes genuinely happy, or that their domestic lives were merely performance without substance. Both things were true simultaneously. There was real pleasure in a well-run household, real satisfaction in good work, real warmth in the relationships that domestic life sustained, and there was also the constant wearing cost of the performance, which never completely turned off. Reaching the bedroom and closing the door was therefore a release that was partly about the corset and partly about something else, something larger and harder to name. The closing of the door was the closing of the stage. The audience was gone. The performance could end for the night. What remained when the performance ended was the actual woman. She might be tired in ways the performance had not let her show. She might be worried about things that were not manageable through the proper exercise of domestic virtue. She might be sad, she might be bored, she might be lonely in a marriage that was technically successful by every available social measure. She might simply be herself, in the most ordinary and private sense of that phrase, for the first time since she had woken that morning. The Victorian bedroom held all of this, and no one talked about it much in the published record. It lived in the diaries, in the letters to close female friends, written late at night when the house was quiet and something true could be said. In the occasional moment of unusual candor in a memoir written in old age. Something that comes up repeatedly in the private writings of Victorian women is the experience of lying awake, the insomnia, or what we would call insomnia now, that accompanied the late Victorian years particularly. The literature on Victorian nervousness and neurasthenia, the diagnosis applied, often to women, to conditions that we might now describe as anxiety, depression, burnout, or some combination of these, is substantial. Victorian physicians and social commentators identified what they called the increase of nervous disorders in the second half of the 19th century and attributed it variously to the pace of modern life, the strain of the railway and the telegraph, the disruption of traditional patterns of work and rest, the excessive stimulation of urban living. What they identified accurately, even if they attributed it to wrong causes, was that Victorian middle-class women were not sleeping especially well. The combination of physical constriction, the corset, worn for 12 to 14 hours, social performance, limited physical exercise for many women of the better classes, and genuine psychological pressures created conditions for poor sleep. Lying awake in a Victorian bedroom in the small hours was described in the private writings of the period with a vividness that speaks to the frequency of the experience, the way the house sounds when it is fully asleep and you are not, the particular quality of 3 in the morning, which is not the beginning of the night and not the end of it, but a middle place where the mind tends to circle back over everything it has been avoiding, the fire almost out, the room cooled considerably, the sounds of the street outside, which even at that hour in a Victorian town were not entirely silent, the occasional cart horse, the watchman's lantern, the distant sounds of a city that never completely stopped. Some Victorian women developed specific strategies for lying awake that they recorded with a kind of practical pragmatism. Prayer was one. The shift from anxious wakefulness to prayerful wakefulness was something many Victorian women had learnt to make, not always easily or immediately, but consistently enough to be worth noting. Meditation on scripture, not reading, because the candle might already be out, but the slow mental movement through memorized passages, was another. The mental recitation of the catechism, or of hymn verses, which could be genuinely calming, not because of their theological content specifically, but because the rhythm of verse, the predictable form of it, gave the mind something to follow rather than letting it range. Others lit a candle if they had been trying to sleep in darkness and accepted that sleep was not coming yet, picked up whatever was on the night table and read until the tiredness came back. Others wrote a letter begun in the mind while lying awake, composed mentally in the dark, then actually committed to paper when it became clear that sleep was not arriving. Victorian correspondence produced in the small hours has a particular quality, a directness, a willingness to say something true that the daytime letter often lacks. I want to talk about winter specifically because the Victorian bedroom in winter was a genuinely different environment from the Victorian bedroom in summer, and the night routine adjusted accordingly in ways worth knowing. The English winter, and we are centering this story largely in England, though the patterns extended across the British Isles and across the considerable Victorian diaspora, was cold, dark and damp in ways that the Victorian bedroom confronted without the resources we now take for granted. No central heating, no double glazing, no insulated walls. The stone or brick construction of most Victorian houses conducted cold efficiently from the outside in, and in rooms where the fire was not kept burning all night, the temperature fell toward the ambient outdoor temperature as the night progressed. The preparations for a winter night consequently had a specific urgency. The fireguard was particularly important. The warming pan was actually used. The flannel nightgown, or the addition of a knitted bed jacket, was the practical choice rather than the lighter summer options. The additional blankets were deployed not as a comfort measure, but as a necessity. The window, whatever the ventilation principle demanded, was probably left open only a fraction on the coldest nights. The cold created its own relationship with the bed. Getting into a cold bed, before the warming pan had done its work, or in a household that didn't have one, required a particular kind of intention. You chose to enter the cold, rather than remaining in whatever marginal warmth the room still contained. You tucked yourself in quickly, pulled the blankets up, and then lay through the brief miserable minutes of the bed warming around you from your body's own heat. Victorian beds were warm once they had been inhabited for a while. The layered system of mattresses and blankets and the enclosed space of the half-tester or the bed curtains created a microclimate that was genuinely comfortable, but the getting there required a short period of determination, and Victorian women's accounts of winter nights give a sense of that, the fortitude of it, the small bodily drama of choosing warmth over the alternatives. Summer nights brought their own challenges. The Victorian bedroom in summer could be oppressively warm, particularly in the earlier decades before the general adoption of Venetian blinds and roller blinds allowed some control over solar gain through the day. The corset worn in summer heat created particular physical misery, and the relief of its removal was accordingly more dramatic. The nightgown, even a light cotton one, could feel heavy in the warmth of a midsummer bedroom. The windows were opened wider, though with attendant concerns about insects and street noise. Victorian sleep in summer tended to be lighter and more interrupted than in winter, according to the private accounts of women who noted these patterns. The light lasted longer in the evening, which meant retiring in daylight during the longest weeks of the year, a curious inversion of the winter darkness that fell hours before anyone went to bed. The birds began before 5 in the morning. The street outside was audible earlier. Children. A Victorian woman with children had a night routine that was shaped by them in ways that it is impossible to leave out. Children were central to Victorian domestic ideology in ways that sometimes strain belief. The mother's role, the specific, non-delegable emotional and moral role of the Victorian mother, was defined primarily in relation to her children. She was their primary moral educator. She was the guardian of their souls as much as their bodies. She was expected to be available to them in ways that the father, however present, was not quite expected to be. The night was not exempt from this. Young children required checking before the mother retired for the night. A last visit to the nursery. In grander households, a separate room managed by the nurse. In ordinary households, a shared bedroom, or simply a cot in the parents' room, to ensure they were settled, warm, not feverish, not disturbed by whatever minor ailments small Victorian children were prone to in their considerable number. Nursing infants, of course, meant that the Victorian woman's night routine was genuinely disrupted by feeding schedules. Victorian mothers fed their babies through the night not because they were particularly committed to any particular philosophy of infant care, but because that was what the baby required. Wet nurses existed in wealthy households. In the majority of households, the mother managed this herself. The Victorian literature on infant health and maternal duty is enormous and largely not comforting reading. It combined genuine medical observation with considerable moral freight about the meaning of maternal devotions, but the practical reality it describes is recognizable across centuries. A new baby meant fractured sleep. The night routine that we are describing in these pages, the careful sequence of hair and face and skin and prayer and reading, existed fully only for women not currently managing an infant. For the rest, the night was organized around a different schedule. The baby's schedule and the careful preparations of the dressing table happened in the margins between feeds. Older children brought different interruptions. The Victorian child who had nightmares, who woke with a cough, who appeared at the bedroom door with a need that was half physical and half the simple desire for parental presence. These were constants of Victorian family life, as they are constants of family life in every era. The Victorian mother's response to these interruptions was shaped by the same moral framework that shaped everything else: patience, availability, the willingness to put her own rest aside for the child's immediate need. Whether this was always provided with the serenity that Victorian domestic ideology described is another matter. The servants' experience of the Victorian night deserves its own section because it was genuinely different from their mistresses, and because not understanding it leaves the picture incomplete. The lady's maid, as we have described, was present through the preparation for the night, but all servants were affected by the household schedule in ways that their mistress was not. The housemaid who had been at work since 6 or 6:30 in the morning, lighting fires, cleaning grates, preparing the kitchen range, beginning the sequence of daily cleaning that Victorian household management required, had a night routine that was considerably more abbreviated than her employers. She had a bed, typically in an attic room or in the basement servants' quarters depending on the house's layout. She had a narrow iron bedstead with a straw or flock mattress rather than the layered feather comfort of the family's beds. She had a minimum of private space, sometimes a room shared with another servant, sometimes a room to herself if the household was large enough. Her preparation for sleep was quick. There was not the elaborate ritual of the corset and the gown and the hair and the skin, because she had different clothes, fewer layers, less elaborate hair arrangements. There was perhaps a brief wash with cold water. There was probably prayer. Victorian working-class religious observance was genuine and widespread, and the servant who said her prayers before bed was not performing piety for anyone's benefit but her own. And then there was sleep, the sleep of genuine physical tiredness rather than the socially manufactured exhaustion of the middle-class day. The servants' night could be interrupted by the household's needs in ways that their mistress's night was not. A bell rung from the mistress's room meant someone had to go up. A new baby in the nursery might mean the nurse was up through the night. The cook who banked the kitchen range before bed was also the one who relit it in the morning before the household woke, which meant she was alert to its condition through the night, in a way that was semi-automatic rather than fully conscious. Between the servant's narrow bed and the mistress's curtained four-poster was a distance that was social and material and physical all at once. They were in the same house, they breathed the same night air of the same building, but their nights were entirely different experiences of what it meant to rest. Hannah Culwick, in her diary, writes of lying awake in the servants' hall listening to the sounds of the house and thinking about what lay ahead the next day, the specific sequence of tasks that would begin before dawn and continue without any meaningful pause until evening. The tiredness she describes is the tiredness of a body that does not always get enough rest to fully recover before it must begin again. Let us return to the bedroom, to the mistress, to the final stage of the night. The fire is almost out. The candle has been snuffed or is guttering toward its end. The prayers have been said, the book has been set aside. The house is quiet in the particular way that a house becomes quiet when everyone in it is genuinely still. What happened to a Victorian woman at the approach of sleep is not something she wrote about directly very often, because it was private in a way that even the private record respects. But what comes through in the aggregate of private writings from the period is something like this. There was a surrendering of the day, a letting go of whatever the day had required. The prayers had moved in that direction, the committing of the day's events and the night's uncertainties into something larger than the self. The reading had moved in that direction. The warmth of the bed and the body's real tiredness moved in that direction. Sleep, for the Victorian woman who arrived at it after the full sequence of her preparation, came at the end of a genuine process, not a collapse, a conclusion. The dreams that came were their own territory, and the Victorian relationship with dreams is a subject that would require its own long story. Briefly, Victorian women took their dreams seriously, not in the specific analytical tradition that Freud would bring to bear at the very end of the century, but in a more general sense of dreams as significant, as carrying meaning, as worth noting in the diary or thinking about in the morning. Dreams of the dead were particularly common in the Victorian imagination because the Victorian period was marked by high mortality in ways that made the dead a constant presence in the lives of the living, the dead mother, the dead child, the dead friend. Dreams in which they appeared were not considered simply as products of the sleeping mind, but as something that touched, perhaps, on the reality of their continued existence somewhere beyond the veil. This is deeply Victorian in its specific form, and yet recognizable in its emotional content. The people we love who are gone show up in our dreams, and we feel something about this, regardless of what we believe about what dreams mean. The Victorian woman who woke from a dream of her dead daughter was feeling something that required no particular theology to understand. There is a kind of seasonal nature to the Victorian night routine that is worth dwelling on, because the year imposed different textures on the private hours, and the women of the era were attentive to these rhythms. Spring nights in a Victorian bedroom had a specific quality. The days were lengthening, which meant going to bed later in terms of the degree of dark outside, and the lighter, brisker air that came through the opened window smelt differently from the winter air, of earth rather than coal smoke, of something growing rather than something confined. The bed coverings were being reduced as the weeks passed, the extra blankets put away in the cedar chest, the winter flannel nightgown replaced by the lighter summer cotton. The skin, which had been tended through a long dry winter with rather more oil and cream than warm weather would require, was beginning to change too. The complexion improved in spring, as Victorian women noted in their diaries, the winter pallor lifting, the dryness of the cold months softening. Autumn nights had an urgency about them that spring did not. The preparations for winter, for the long cold stretch ahead, were underway in every part of the household, and this extended to the bedroom. The summer linens were being laundered and stored, the thicker blankets were coming out, the flannel petticoats were back in rotation. There was a quality in autumn evenings of gathering together, of closing ranks against the coming cold, that was physical and social and psychological all at once. The autumn was also, in a Victorian household, the season of certain domestic productions, the preserving season, the time of pickling and jamming and storing, that was mostly the kitchen's domain, but that permeated the whole house with its smells, sharp vinegar, sweet cooked fruit, the hot sugar smell of jam making, in ways that entered the bedroom at night on the warmth of the house. Summer nights in the Victorian bedroom, for women who could manage it, sometimes extended to include a certain amount of outdoor evening in a way that the other seasons did not allow. Sitting in the garden in the long summer dusk, walking in the evening coolness before coming in. There is a kind of summer Victorian evening that is genuinely beautiful and that comes through in the period's poetry and painting. The long golden light, the garden flowers at their fullest, the relaxed quality of a summer dusk, and the transition from that outdoor version of the evening into the interior and the bedroom had its own gentle quality. There are women whose specific night routines have been recorded in enough detail that we can follow them individually, and I want to do that for a few of them, because the aggregate and the individual are different kinds of knowledge, and both matter. Florence Nightingale, who is primarily remembered for her work in the Crimea and for her foundational contribution to modern nursing, was also a woman whose health was chronically poor for most of her adult life, and who spent enormous periods of her later years largely confined to her bedroom. Her night routine, documented in her correspondence and in the accounts of those who cared for her, was organized around the management of a body that was genuinely unwell in ways that modern diagnosis would probably identify as chronic fatigue syndrome or a related condition, though the Victorians had no such category. Nightingale, confined to her rooms but by no means inactive, she continued to work, to write, to manage a considerable correspondence, to reform institutions from her bed, had a night routine that was necessarily different from the fully active woman's. The corset was not a constant for her in the years of her illness. The elaborate hairdressing was simplified. What remained was the skin care, the reading, the prayer, and the writing, the elements of the night routine that had nothing to do with the body's management for social performance and everything to do with the interior life. Her letters from her bedroom, written late in the evening when the household had gone quiet, have a particular quality of honesty that her public work does not quite allow for. She was thinking about things deeply. She was angry sometimes. She was tired, consistently. She was genuinely faithful in her religious life, though her particular faith was heterodox enough to have troubled more conventional Anglicans. The night was the time when the real work of her mind happened, and the physical rituals of the night routine were the frame around that work. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who spent years in a bedroom in Wimpole Street under the force of a health collapse that began in her early 20s and from which she eventually recovered, though she never entirely regained robust health, wrote poems at night, by candlelight, in the way that many Victorian women with literary ambitions found the private hours to be the time when something true could be written. The sonnets from the Portuguese, written during her courtship with Robert Browning, were the product of exactly this kind of private, night-hour creativity. They were not shared until years after they had been written. They lived in the private space of the bedroom long before they reached any public. George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, who was perhaps the greatest English novelist of the Victorian era, was a night owl by inclination and worked late into the evenings with a consistency that her companion George Henry Lewes noted with both admiration and some concern for her health. Her preparation for sleep was, by the accounts that survive, hasty relative to the elaborate standard we have been describing. She was absorbed in work and tended not to transition gradually towards sleep, but to work until she could not continue and then to stop. The hair and the skin and the other physical rituals happened, but as quickly as possible. What is interesting about Eliot is the insomnia. She suffered from it persistently and wrote about the experience with the same precision she brought to everything. The lying awake, the mind continuing to work on the problems of the current book or the current moral argument even when the body had stopped. The particular difficulty of a mind that would not consent to rest. She developed a practice of what she called passive lying still, not attempting to force sleep, but simply allowing the mind to move freely without directing it, which she found more restorative than the anxious attempts to stop thinking that were the usual response to lying awake. The changing decades of the Victorian era changed the night routine in specific, traceable ways. In the 1840s and 1850s, the night routine was embedded in a household with more servants, more elaborate formal structures, stricter rules about every aspect of appearance and conduct. The corset was the boned and heavily structured variety. The crinoline of the mid-century created a specific undressing challenge. The large cage of steel hoops had to be removed before anything else. and it required a certain spatial awareness to navigate without catching the wire on the furniture. The nightcap was still standard. The family prayers were more likely to be formal and comprehensive. The bedroom was probably colder. By the 1870s and 1880s, the middle class had expanded and differentiated. More households managed fewer servants or none at all. The bustle replaced the crinoline, requiring different undressing choreography but arguably less architectural drama. The nightcap was becoming optional. The corset remained, but the front-opening busk and the design changes that made self-dressing more possible had altered the relationship with it slightly. By the 1890s, and certainly by the very end of Victoria's reign in 1901, the younger generation of middle-class women was managing a night routine that had some meaningful differences from their mothers and grandmothers. The rational dress movement had begun challenging the most extreme aspects of Victorian corsetry. New kinds of exercise, newly available to women in this period, cycling was the most conspicuous example, had given some women bodies that engaged differently with the corseting question. Electric light was coming into the more prosperous Victorian homes, which changed the quality and availability of illumination after dark and altered the feel of the late evening in subtle ways. The skincare routine evolved too. The late Victorian decades brought an expansion of the commercial cosmetics market, the first branded preparations, the beginnings of the beauty industry in something like its modern form. Names like Pond's and Vaseline appear in the late Victorian period. Commercially manufactured cold cream became more standardized. The apothecary's shelves held more specifically cosmetic products and fewer general remedies. A woman at the end of the Victorian era was choosing between branded products in a way that a woman at the beginning of it had not been. The nightgown itself became, at the end of the century, rather more elaborate in its construction than the plain white shift of the early decades. Trousseau collections became increasingly aspirational objects, and the nightgowns within them reflected the period's taste for ornamentation, broderie anglaise, tucks, insertions of lace, pine-tucked yokes. This was partly a reflection of improved manufacturing that made fine needlework available at lower cost. It was also partly the growing commodification of domesticity that the latter Victorian decades witnessed, the increasingly sophisticated marketing of household goods to women who were being addressed, for the first time in a really organized way, as consumers. The question I find myself returning to when I think about all of this is what the Victorian woman's night routine reveals about her life that the daylight hours do not. And what it reveals is this, that the day was largely not her own. The day was managed, organized around the requirements of the household, the social calendar, the expectations of the class she inhabited, and the role she occupied within it. She was the mistress of the house, which meant she was responsible for its function and its face in a way that was relentless and largely unacknowledged. She was her husband's wife, which meant a whole additional set of obligations, from the social to the intimate, that operated on his schedule rather than hers. She was her children's mother, which was presented as the deepest meaning of her existence, but which was also simply a great deal of daily labor. She was the Victorian feminine ideal, which meant she was performing constantly, adjusting constantly, managing the gap constantly between who she actually was and who the world expected her to be. The night routine was the hinge. It was the process of transitioning from that performed, managed, public existence to whatever brief, private existence was available in the small hours. The unpinning of the hair was real, the taking off of the corset was real, the sitting alone at the dressing table was real. The diary entry written in the last hour before sleep was real. The prayer said quietly in the dark was real. For many Victorian women, these private acts were the realest things of their day, not more important than the love they genuinely felt for their children, or the pleasure they genuinely took in their household accomplishments, or the intellectual and social life that the Victorian middle class did provide for women of a certain kind of intelligence and energy, but real in a different way, unwitnessed, unmanaged, belonging entirely to themselves. There is a letter written by a woman named Mary, sometime in the 1870s, that I read in a collection of Victorian women's correspondence, and that I have thought about many times since. She is writing to her sister late at night, and she writes, When I extinguish the last candle and lie in the dark and the house is entirely quiet, I sometimes feel a great peace and sometimes a great longing, and I can never quite decide whether they are the same thing or not. I do not know everything that she meant. I do not know what she longed for, specifically, or what the peace contained. But the description of lying in the Victorian dark, at the end of the full sequence of the night's preparations, feeling something that was both peace and longing simultaneously, that I understand, and I suspect you do too. Let me take you through one final full evening. Not a summary, but a walkthrough. One woman, one night, in something close to real time. She is the wife of a solicitor in a prosperous northern English city. This is the 1880s, the mature Victorian era. The house is substantial enough to have a cook and a general housemaid, but she does not have a lady's maid. She manages her own hair and dressing, with the help of the housemaid on formal occasions. On ordinary evenings she does it herself. The last guest has left. Her husband is still in his study downstairs, dealing with correspondence. The children, 3 of them between the ages of 7 and 13, were in bed an hour ago. The housemaid, Sarah, finished her duties at 9:30 and is now in her room above the kitchen. She carries a candle upstairs. The bedroom is cool. The fire, which Sarah laid earlier in the evening, has been burning for 2 hours and has produced a reasonable warmth without making the room oppressive. She sets the candle on the dressing table. The table is arranged as it always is. The hand mirror at a slight angle, the pin dish empty and waiting, the cold cream jar with its lid slightly ajar from this morning's use, the rose water in its glass bottle with a ground stopper, the brush and comb aligned parallel. She sits. The reflection that meets her is a face she knows well and looks at with a particular kind of neutral familiarity, the way you look at a room you have lived in for years, present but not astonished. She begins to remove the pins from her hair. 1, 2, 3, placed in the dish with the small metallic sounds that mark this hour. The hair, which has been up since 7 this morning, begins to relax as the pins come out. By the time the last one is placed, the whole arrangement has softened and begun to fall. She draws her fingers through it once, gently, feeling for any remaining tangle before beginning with the comb. The comb takes 5 minutes. She is thorough with the ends first, patient about a stubborn tangle at the nape of her neck, where the day's arrangement has pressed the hair against itself. The brush. She counts without quite counting, the strokes automatic, the motion rhythmic enough to be almost restful. The fire makes the occasional sound in the grate. Outside, a carriage passes at a distance. Her face. Cold cream applied with the practiced economy of someone who has done this every night for 20 years. The small circular movements outward from the nose, the neck stroked upward, a moment of leaving it, then the cloth, warm because she warmed it slightly in the water in the ewer. The cream and the day's grime removed together, the cloth turned to a clean section, pressed again against the skin. The rose water. She pours a small amount onto the cotton cloth, kept in a small glass on the tray. The smell of it is immediate and familiar. She applies it to her face and neck, pressing rather than wiping, letting it sit for a moment before patting dry. The glycerin, a very small amount, worked between her palms first to warm it before applying it to her hands, which are dry from this time of year. She braids her hair, one long plait, quickly, efficiently, secured with a length of tape. She doesn't wear a nightcap, hasn't for several years now, since her eldest daughter mocked them gently at Christmas, and she found the mockery more effective than she expected. The corset. She reaches behind herself for the laces, loosening the bow she tied this morning, working the tension out of the back lacings until the corset can be opened from the front, which it can, the busk releasing with the 3 small metal sounds of its fastenings. The relief of this moment is the same every night and never entirely anticipated. The ribcage expands, a deeper breath than any breath she has taken since this morning. She holds the corset for a moment before hanging it over the towel horse by the window, where the night air, she has left the window cracked, she is firmly of the fresh air school, will do its work on it through the night. The petticoats. The chemise replaced with a fresh one she brought up earlier. The nightgown, which she has not placed to warm near the fire because she is not, she tells herself, someone who requires that particular indulgence. She puts it on. Floor-length white cotton, high-necked, long-sleeved, plain except for a small frill at the collar and cuffs, the familiar weight and volume of it settling around her. She climbs into bed. The sheets are slightly cold. There is no warming pan. This is an ordinary evening, and she adjusts the blankets and waits with the slightly grim patience of long practice for her body's warmth to begin its work on the linen. She reads. The book she is currently working through is a novel by Thomas Hardy, which she is finding both absorbing and rather more melancholy than she had anticipated. She reads for perhaps half an hour by the light of the candle on the small bedside table. Her husband will come up eventually. She is not waiting for him exactly, but she is aware of his absence and will not be asleep before he arrives. This is the texture of a marriage of 20 years, not romantic expectation in the early marriage sense, but a practiced attentiveness to the presence and absence of the person you have built your life alongside. She sets the book down. The candle is still burning. She says her prayers, which are private and which we will not follow into their specifics, but which take perhaps 5 minutes and move, as they always do, from the general to the particular, the acknowledgement of the day, the naming of those she loves and those she worries for, the request for the sleep that she genuinely needs and does not always get. Her husband comes up a little after 11. They speak briefly, quietly, something about a matter to do with one of the children's schools, something that needs to be decided in the morning rather than tonight. The candle is extinguished. The room goes dark, except for the low remaining glow of the fire. She lies awake for a while. This is ordinary. She lies still, which she has learned is better than restlessness, and the mind moves through what it needs to move through. After 20 minutes or so, the tiredness reasserts itself. The warmth of the bed and the dark and the quiet of the house do their slow work. Sleep comes, not dramatically, not with ceremony, as sleep always comes, in the end, to the prepared body and the quieted mind, slowly and then fully and without announcement. When she wakes in the morning, the bedroom will be cold, the fire will need relighting, the ritual will reverse itself, corset, petticoats, hair pinned up with the same pins that spent the night in the pin dish, and the day will begin with its full complement of requirements and performances and small invisible exhaustions. But for now, through the Victorian night, through those particular hours that belonged more nearly to herself than any others, she has rested in the way that was available to her, in the frame that her era and her class and her specific life had built around the act of rest. The night has done what it does. The morning is still hours away. There is a quality in the Victorian night, when you have spent enough time inside the private records of it, that is hard to name precisely. It is something about the texture of a life lived close to its own limits, not the limits of poverty or extreme hardship. The woman whose night we have been following was, in material terms, comfortable and secure, but the limits of a particular kind of existence. The corset and the pin dish and the cold cream and the prayer and the pages of the Hardy novel and the brief exchange with the husband about the children's school. These are the limits of a Victorian middle-class woman's night in a deep sense. This is as much as the frame allows. This is the private existence available within the structure of the public one. And within those limits there was real life, real thought, real feeling, real care for the body, real attention to the spirit, real rest when it came. I find that genuinely moving when I let myself sit with it. Not because the limits were right or because the structure was good. We have moved beyond many of its particular constraints for reasons that are sound and that should not be reversed. But because within those constraints, women made something of their evenings. They made rituals of care that were thoughtful and sometimes quite effective. They made spaces of private reflection in a life that offered few others. They preserved in those hours whatever was most essentially their own. That is worth noticing, that deserves to be named. And so, finally, we pull back from the Victorian bedroom. The fire is a few embers now. The pin dish holds its complement of pins. The cold cream jar has been replaced with its lid. The rose water stands at attention on the dressing table. The braid lies dark against the white pillow. The nightcap, or the absence of it, depending on the decade and the woman. Everything is in its place, everything is tended, everything is prepared. The Victorian night does what all nights do in the end. It holds us, briefly, in the particular darkness of its own era, with all the specific constraints and comforts and rituals of that era intact around us. And then the darkness softens toward morning, and the world that was waiting outside all along comes back in through the cracked open window. But for now it is still night. For now the house is quiet. For now the woman at the center of all this care and routine and ritual is asleep. That is enough. That in the end is always enough. Thank you for spending this night with me. Thank you for being here on Sleepy Old World, wherever in the world you are, at whatever hour you're listening, in whatever degree of horizontal you've managed to achieve. If something in tonight's story stayed with you, a detail that surprised you, a moment that felt unexpectedly true, a question that opened rather than closed, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop a comment when you have a moment. Tell me which part of the Victorian night you found most unexpected, or which part felt somehow familiar. If this channel feels like the right company for your late hours, please consider subscribing. There are more nights like this one waiting, more worlds to step into before sleep, more ordinary lives worth the full weight of our attention. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. The pins are in the dish, the candle is out, the window is cracked just enough for the night air. Rest now. End of script. Sleepy Old World, night routines women followed in Victorian times, extended sections, additional content. There are things we haven't fully explored yet about the Victorian night, and I want to go back to the bedroom, back to the hour between the social evening and the actual retiring, back to the specific geography of the Victorian house at night and what it felt like to move through it. Because the bedroom was not the only room of the night, even for a woman who spent most of it there. The Victorian house at night was a world of organized darkness and carefully maintained fire. Understanding what it felt like to move through it after the household had settled, to carry your candlestick from room to room, to check the windows, to look in on the children, to go back down for the book you forgot, is part of understanding what the Victorian evening actually was. The candlestick she carried was almost certainly the standard chamber stick, a broad, shallow saucer of pottery or metal with a short central holder for the candle and a ring handle on the side. The breadth of the saucer was practical. It caught the drips of melting wax, it provided a stable base, and it could be set down on any surface without risk of tipping. The handle allowed it to be carried through doorways and around furniture without the careful two-handed balance that a taller candlestick would require. It was a working object, functional rather than decorative, and it was found in every Victorian household of every class. The quality of candlelight in a Victorian house at night was both more and less than we tend to imagine. More than the barely there suggestion of modern candles lit for atmosphere, less than any electric light at all. A single good candle, beeswax, which burned cleaner and brighter than tallow, produced something that our eyes, accustomed to artificial light, would find surprisingly adequate. You could read by one candle held at the right distance. You could see the details of a room you knew well. You could navigate a familiar staircase safely enough. But the darkness at the edges was real. The corners of a Victorian room, beyond the candle's reach, were genuinely dark. The staircase above the candle's glow was dark. The landing between one room and the next was dark unless another candle was burning somewhere ahead. The Victorian night was full of gradations, pools of warm light, zones of dimness, pockets of real dark, and moving through it was a physical and perceptual experience quite different from switching on a light switch. Gas lighting, where it had reached Victorian homes by the middle decades of the century, changed some of this. Gas wall fixtures in the principal rooms, the parlour, the dining room, the hallway, provided a steadier, brighter light than candles and could be left burning at a low level for some hours without the constant management that candles required. But gas was not universally installed even in urban middle-class homes through much of the Victorian period, and where it was installed it was confined to the downstairs rooms used for entertaining and living. The bedrooms remained candlelit throughout most of the era. The kitchen remained candlelit. The back stairs, the servants' quarters, the upper floors of most Victorian houses were managed by candlelight right through to the electric conversion, which came to most middle-class homes only in the final decade of the century at the very earliest, and often much later than that. The woman carrying her chamber stick upstairs at the end of the evening moved from gaslight to candlelight as she crossed from the public to the private spaces of her house. This was not a purely symbolic transition, though the symbolism was there. It was a literal change in the quality of illumination that she moved through. The world above the first landing was the candle-lit world, the older world, the world that operated on a different visual register from the modernity below. I want to talk about the Victorian woman's relationship with her bedroom in winter more fully, because winter was the dominant season of the Victorian night in a psychological sense, even if it lasted only a few months. Winter condensed the day. It made the evenings long and the mornings dark, and the nights cold in ways that compressed everything that happened in the private hours into a kind of intensity. The fire in the grate was not a comfort option, it was a necessity. The pile of blankets was not aesthetic excess, it was survival. The hot drink, the warm milk, the beef tea, the cup of cocoa that became fashionable in the latter Victorian decades was not a luxury treat. It was the body's reasonable request for warmth from the inside when the warmth from the outside had become inadequate. Cocoa deserves its own moment here because it is a very specifically Victorian arrival in the bedroom night routine. Cocoa, or more precisely the drinking chocolate preparations marketed from the 1860s onward under names that have survived almost unchanged to the present, was a relatively new presence in the Victorian household by the middle decades of the century. The cocoa plant had been known in Europe since the 16th century, but the processed forms that made it easy to dissolve and drink were mid-Victorian innovations. Cadbury's cocoa powder, introduced in 1866 using what was then a new Dutch process technique for removing excess cocoa butter, was a significantly more palatable drink than the earlier preparations, which were often greasy and difficult to mix. By the 1870s and 1880s, a cup of cocoa before bed had become a middle-class habit sufficiently well established to appear in domestic advice books as a standard bedtime provision. It was warm, it was sweet. It contained, as we now know and the Victorians were beginning to suspect in pharmacological terms, theobromine, a compound that has mild stimulant properties but also, paradoxically, mild relaxant effects on smooth muscle, which may have contributed to the cocoa cup's reputation as a sleep aid. It also contained a genuinely significant amount of sugar in most Victorian preparations, and the quick energy provided by that sugar was followed by the inevitable drop that would have contributed to the drowsiness that followed. The bedtime cocoa cup was brought up by the housemaid, or made by the woman herself in the kitchen, before coming upstairs. In households where the kitchen was several flights of stairs away from the bedroom, bringing the cocoa up still hot required some advanced planning and a reasonably insulated cup arrangement. The thick pottery mug was better than a thin china one for this purpose, though china was considered more correct, which created its own small domestic dilemma. The drinking of the cocoa was one of the last of the night's sequential acts before the candle went out. It belonged to the sitting up in bed portion of the evening, after the nightgown was on and the prayers said and the reading done. It was warm in the hands and warm going down, and it concluded the evening in a small, bodily, satisfying way. The smell of it in the dark Victorian bedroom, warm chocolate, a little sweet, is something I find oddly evocative when I think about it. A smell associated now with childhood and cold evenings and the kitchen when you are 9 years old and someone is making something comforting. In a Victorian bedroom in January, for a tired woman at the end of a long day, it must have felt something like that too. The question of what a Victorian woman's night looked like when she was unwell is a distinct subchapter, because Victorian women were unwell rather a lot by modern standards, and the management of ill health at home was a significant component of the Victorian domestic knowledge base. Victorian women's health was compromised in specific ways by the conditions of their lives. The corset, as we have discussed, created real physical problems for some wearers: restricted breathing, altered posture, occasional digestive disruption. The limited physical exercise available to many middle-class women, particularly in the earlier Victorian decades when vigorous outdoor exercise was considered unfeminine, contributed to what Victorian physicians called nervous debility and what we might call poor cardiovascular fitness. The standard Victorian diet, heavy in meat and refined carbohydrates and relatively light in fresh vegetables, particularly in winter, contributed to various nutritional deficiencies. Anemia was common, headaches were common. The cluster of symptoms that the Victorians grouped under the label of neuralgia, generalized nerve pain, often centered in the face or head, was a persistent complaint in the diaries of women who were otherwise in reasonable health. Menstrual difficulties were rarely spoken of directly in the diaries and letters that have survived, because Victorian propriety resisted this territory even in private writing, but the domestic advice books on women's health make clear that they were a significant source of recurring monthly suffering for many women. The Victorian woman who was unwell at night retreated further into the bedroom rather than going out from it. The sick room in Victorian domestic medicine was a managed environment with specific protocols: fresh air but not drafts, warmth but not stuffiness, quiet but not the oppressive silence that suggested the condition was serious. The diet in illness was carefully graduated, from beef tea and arrowroot gruel at the beginning of an illness to more substantial things as recovery progressed. The nursing of illness within the household fell primarily to the women. This is not surprising given the general structure of Victorian domestic responsibility, but it created a particular irony in the case of the woman who was herself unwell, who nursed the nurse. In practice, other women, neighbours who took turns, family members who came to stay, the housemaid who was occasionally deputised beyond her usual duties, but the expectation of the era placed the ill woman herself in a curious position, expected to be the manager of her own illness in a way that her household's well-being required, even while also being the patient. There is a letter from a woman in the 1860s who describes managing a sick household, husband with influenza, 2 children with the same, herself beginning to feel the early signs, with a dry humour that does not entirely disguise the genuine exhaustion. "I am nursing everyone," she writes to her sister, "and I find that the most efficient method is to become ill oneself last, as there is then at least someone left standing to provide the gruel." She became ill last, she recovered last. She wrote this letter, the historian who found it noted, probably while sitting up in bed. The letter writing, the correspondence, the specific activity of writing letters in the late evening or by lamplight in the bedroom, this deserves more attention than I gave it earlier, because it was one of the most significant things Victorian women did in their private hours, and one of the things that preserved for us the record we have of what those hours actually contained. Victorian letter writing was not what we do now when we send an email. It was not even what we do when we write a reasonably considered message to someone we care about. Victorian letter writing was a genre with conventions, a practice with standards, and for many middle-class women a genuine creative and intellectual undertaking. The letter required the correct paper. For women of the middle classes, this was typically a quarto sheet, slightly larger than modern A5, of white or cream writing paper of good quality. Poorer quality paper was available for less important correspondence. The better quality paper was reserved for important connections. The paper might have a small engraved heading with the house address and sometimes a decorative device. Modest, understated, because ostentation in stationery was considered vulgar. The pen in the mid-Victorian period was the steel-nib dip pen, the quill having been gradually displaced through the 1840s. The dip pen was dipped into an inkwell at regular intervals, every several words or when the nib ran dry, which introduced a specific rhythm to the writing process. You wrote a phrase, dipped, wrote another. This was not quite the uninterrupted flow of modern writing instruments. It created its own pace. The handwriting itself was an art form. Victorian penmanship, the specific styles taught in schools throughout the period, with their careful formation of letters, their controlled flourishes, their consistent slope and weight, was considered a direct reflection of character. Bad handwriting implied carelessness of mind, lack of discipline, inattentiveness to the requirements of social communication. Good handwriting implied the opposite. Victorian women's handwriting, in the letters and diaries that survive, is often remarkably beautiful by our standards, elegant, consistent, clearly the product of sustained training and practice. Writing in the evening, in the bedroom, was a different experience from writing at the desk in the morning. The evening writing was more personal, more likely to be the letter to the close friend rather than the letter to the house agent, more likely to contain something true. The diary entry written at the end of the day, when the events of it were still immediate, had a rawness that the properly ordered letter did not quite permit. There is a tradition in Victorian women's correspondence of the late-night letter, the letter that begins by noting the hour, that acknowledges the particular quality of writing in the dark when the house is quiet, that allows a different register of speech than the letter written during proper hours. These letters are often the most interesting ones to read, the most alive. They were written by women who had more to say than the day had given them time for, and who found in the private hours of the night a space to say it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's letters, and she was one of the great letter writers of the Victorian era, a status that her fame as a poet has somewhat obscured, often have this quality. Written from her bedroom at Wimpole Street, from the room that was her world for the years of her semi-confinement, they are alive with intelligence and feeling in a way that the public record of her life as an invalid does not quite capture. She was, in those letters, herself in the most complete sense. The invalid role was partly real and partly the frame the world imposed, and in the late-night letters you can see the woman stepping slightly outside the frame. I want to talk about what Victorian women read in bed specifically, because the choice of reading matter reveals something about the inner life of the bedtime hours that generalizations do not quite convey. The novel, which we have already noted was the dominant literary form of the era, was also the dominant bedtime reading. But there is a particular kind of Victorian novel that seems to have been especially well suited to the late-night reading, and that comes up repeatedly in the accounts of what women were reading in their private hours. The sensation novel of the 1860s, the genre associated with Wilkie Collins, with Mrs. Henry Wood, with Mary Elizabeth Braddon, was considered by many contemporary commentators to be exactly the wrong kind of thing to read before sleep. Too stimulating, too exciting, too likely to produce the agitated mental state that interfered with restful sleep. Collins's The Woman in White, with its elaborate plot of identity and imprisonment and conspiracy, was not designed to settle the mind. East Lynne, Mrs. Wood's enormously successful melodrama of adultery and its consequences, was not a calming text. Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, with its murderous golden-haired heroine, was considered rather definitively unsuitable for the small hours. The fact that Victorian women read these novels in bed anyway, and in considerable numbers judging by the sales figures and the circulation records of lending libraries, tells you something about the relationship between the Victorian woman and her private reading. The public advice about what was appropriate reading material for women was one thing, the private choice was another. The sensation novel was exciting in the way that not very much in the regulated surface of Victorian middle-class female life was permitted to be exciting. It involved women doing unexpected things with unexpected energy and occasionally with unexpected moral complexity. It was, in the private hours of the night, a small rebellion, not dramatic, not dangerous, but real. Trollope was more respectable for the bedtime hours and was widely read by women with good conscience, his novels being on the long and comfortable side and providing the kind of extensive, well-observed domestic and social world that a reader could inhabit gradually without agitation. Hardy was more troubling. His women were often beautifully drawn and also often ruined, and the darkness at the end of his plots was not the straightforwardly resolved darkness that the sensation novel dealt in. Hardy's Tess, published in 1891, was deeply controversial and deeply read. George Eliot's novels, Middlemarch in particular, published in installments in 1871 and 1872, were considered serious reading, the kind of reading that demanded more of the mind than could be offered at the tail end of a tired day. And yet Middlemarch, which is about the specific, irreversible constraints of women's lives and about the ways that great souls can be confined within small circumstances, was read by Victorian women with a recognition that the author had not missed in her analysis. The growing good of the world, Eliot wrote at the novel's end, is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. If you read that in bed, in a Victorian bedroom, at the end of a day of unhistoric acts, in a life that would not be visited by history, I think you would feel something. The sound of the Victorian night outside the bedroom window is something worth dwelling on, because it was neither silent nor like the sounds of the modern night. The Victorian city at night had specific sounds that are entirely absent from our experience. The gas lamp in the street below gave off a faint hiss, not intrusive, barely audible from a closed window, but present in the background. The horses that still moved through Victorian streets even at night created a specific sound on the cobblestones, the clopping, uneven rhythm of iron shoes on stone that is absent from any modern soundscape. Victorian streets in cities were cobblestoned, and the acoustic quality of cobblestones is quite different from tarmac, sharper, more resonant, the sound carrying further. Night carts, the vehicles that removed household waste in the hours when they were least socially disruptive, were a feature of Victorian urban nights through much of the period, their work timed to be completed before the proper morning began. The workers drove through streets and alleys with a specific sound and a specific smell that the bedroom window admitted, along with the fresh air that the ventilation school demanded. Railway noise was new to the Victorian period and remained uncanny throughout it. The sound of a distant train at night, the specific cry of steam and iron, was something that the Victorians had no ancestral understanding of, no deep acoustic memory for. It appeared in the Victorian night like a new kind of creature. Some found it disturbing. Others, after a few years, simply incorporated it into the auditory landscape of their nights the way we incorporate the sound of distant traffic. The sound of weather was more immediate in a Victorian house than in a modern one. Uninsulated walls and ill-fitted window frames transmitted the sound of wind, of heavy rain, of sleet on glass, with a directness that our double-glazed, insulated houses reduced to near silence. A winter storm heard from a Victorian bedroom was genuinely present in the room, the windows rattling in their frames, the wind finding the gaps under the sills, the sound of rain on the roof tiles close and loud above the bed. The natural sounds of the seasons were present too. In spring and summer, birdsong began early, often before 5 in the morning in the long days, entering the bedroom through the open window before anyone in the house was ready to be awake. The wood pigeon, which had moved into urban spaces alongside the Victorian expansion of parks and gardens, added its particular 5-note call to the suburban morning chorus. In the countryside, the Victorian night outside the bedroom window was very different from the urban one, quieter in terms of human sound, louder in terms of natural sound. Owls were genuinely present. The sound of the wind in trees surrounding a country house was a consistent element of the night. The countryside dark was also different from the city dark. With no gas lamps, the darkness was more complete, and the stars on a clear night were accordingly more visible and more dramatic. A Victorian woman lying awake in a country house bedroom, listening to an owl and looking at stars through a window she has opened for the air, is having a night experience that very few of us can replicate. The trousseau, the new wife's first Victorian night in her own household. This is a particular case worth examining, because the transition from daughter to wife, which typically meant a transition from a family household to a household of one's own, involved all the routines we have been discussing being remade on one's own terms for the first time. The Victorian trousseau, the collection of household and personal linens assembled for a woman before her marriage, was a major practical and symbolic undertaking. It took months to prepare, involved considerable expense or considerable labour or both, and represented the material provision for the domestic life that was about to begin. The trousseau linens, sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths, napkins, towels, and the personal items, nightgowns, chemises, corset covers, stockings, were typically marked with the new owner's monogram. This marking, done with embroidery or with marking ink, was itself a significant labour and was usually distributed among the women of the family or among paid needlewomen. The initials stitched into the corner of each nightgown were a form of ownership, a small assertion of identity within the new life. The first night of the honeymoon in a Victorian marriage, which was spent in hotels or in country houses or in rented rooms depending on the couple's means, was approached by the new bride with a mixture of feelings that the private writing of the period captures with varying degrees of directness. Some brides wrote about it with genuine warmth and curiosity. Some wrote with anxiety. Some wrote with a strange detachment, as if describing something happening to someone else. Some wrote nothing at all, and left only the gaps in their diaries to tell what they chose not to record. The practical difficulty of undressing on a first night when the husband was new to the proceedings, when neither party had any experience of this specific situation, is recorded in a few Victorian accounts, with a humour that the writers probably earned by surviving it. We mentioned earlier the account of Catherine, who described the wedding night as complicated by the practical challenges of Victorian undressing. Her account is not unusual. The back buttons and the corset laces and the boots with their 15 small fastenings each represented a genuine mechanical challenge for a couple navigating them together for the first time, without the practiced ease of long cohabitation. The new wife's first regular night, The night in her own bedroom in her own household had a different quality from the wedding night. It was the beginning of the routine, the beginning of the sequence that would be repeated with minor variations for the rest of her life. She was establishing it for the first time in a space that was now hers to manage, with objects, the cold cream from her dressing table, the hairbrush she had brought from her parents' house, the rose water that were familiar from her previous life, now recontextualized in a different space. The first dressing table she set up in her own bedroom was an act of self-definition, where she placed each item, the particular order of her preparations, the small habits she was establishing that would become, over years, so ingrained as to be invisible. She was inventing, without quite knowing she was doing it, the night routine she would follow for the next decades. The bedroom of a Victorian widow was a different space from the bedroom of a married woman, and it deserves separate consideration. Victorian widowhood was a long and prominent social category, because Victorian men died rather earlier than their wives, with notable frequency. The combination of occupational hazards, the stresses of public life, and the generally higher mortality rates of middle age that affected men disproportionately created a large Victorian widowed population. These women, often left in financially uncertain circumstances, but sometimes quite well provided for, often left with children still to raise, often in a position of genuine social exposure, had nights that were shaped by their particular form of solitude. The widow's bedroom in Victorian domestic culture had a specific iconography, the portrait of the deceased husband prominently displayed, the mourning dress laid out for the morning, for the appropriate duration of the mourning period, the particular quality of the empty side of the bed, which was noted in diary after diary as one of the most viscerally present facts of widowhood. Queen Victoria's widowhood, which began with the death of Prince Albert in 1861 and lasted until her own death in 1901, was the defining cultural model of Victorian female bereavement and its peculiarities, the 40 years of formal mourning, the preserved bedroom at Windsor where Albert's things were kept exactly as they had been on the day he died, the elaborate rituals of memorial and remembrance that structured Victoria's private and public life for 4 decades, set a tone for the social management of loss that affected the entire culture. The ordinary Victorian widow, with considerably less elaborate mourning provisions available to her, managed her grief in the private hours of the night in ways that the mourning etiquette of the era did not quite address. The etiquette covered what you wore and where you appeared and for how long you maintained full mourning versus half mourning. It did not cover what you did with your thoughts at 3 in the morning when the house was quiet. What the diaries of Victorian widows describe, in that private territory of the night that no etiquette manual governed, is the continuous presence of the person who was gone, in ordinary nights, in dreams that brought him back with the vividness that grieving minds sometimes produce, in the habit of thought, reaching toward a conversation that could not happen, beginning to form a sentence addressed to someone who was no longer there. The night routine continued. The hair was brushed, the face was creamed, the prayers were said, now including the dead. The bed was entered, half of it unused, the sheets on that side smoothed and flat in their particular way that was different from the lived-in side, and in the morning everything began again. I want to spend some time with the question of what Victorian women smelled like in their bedrooms, because smell is the sense that most completely transports you into a historical environment, and it is almost always left out of historical description. A Victorian bedroom smelled of several things simultaneously, and the blend was specific to the era in a way worth attempting to recover. Coal smoke was the dominant note of the Victorian urban environment, and it did not stop at the bedroom door. Everything in a Victorian house carried a faint coal smoke undertone, regardless of how clean it was, because the atmospheric pollution of the Victorian city was of a different order from anything we experience now. The Great Fog of 1886, the series of major London smogs through the second half of the 19th century, the regular yellow fogs that Dickens describes and that Sherlock Holmes navigates, these were the visible expressions of an airborne particulate burden that was constant and chronic. Victorian curtains and bedding absorbed it. Victorian hair, washed only occasionally, held it. Victorian skin was exposed to it. Underneath the coal smoke, the bedroom's own smells, the beeswax used to polish the wooden furniture, which gave off a faint honey and wax warmth, the lavender sachets placed in the clothes press, the cedar of the storage chest, the moth preventatives, naphthalene balls or cedar blocks or dried herbs placed among the stored woolens, the specific clean smell of well-laundered linen, which Victorian laundering produced by a combination of bluing, a bluing agent added to the rinse water to make whites appear brighter, and of sunlight drying and the starch in the pillowcases. The dressing table contributed its own notes, the rose water in its glass bottle, faintly sweet and green and watery in a way that the synthetic rose fragrance of modern cosmetics doesn't quite replicate. The cold cream, which smelled of beeswax and faintly of almonds or of rose depending on the preparation. The almond oil, the glycerin, which has a faint, slightly sweet chemical smell that is neutral at low concentrations. The powder, if used, rice powder or prepared chalk, which smelled of very little. In winter, the coal fire in the grate added its own smell, warmer, more mineral than wood smoke, with a faint sulphurous note at the edges that was simply part of Victorian indoor life. The warming pan brought up briefly a smell of hot metal and coals, and then was removed before it had much time to diffuse. The nightgown itself smelled of the laundry room and of the drawer where it had been stored, and of the human body that had worn it the previous night. Victorian nightgowns were laundered regularly. Weekly was standard in a well-run household, and between launderings they were aired on the towel horse or thrown over the window sash on dry mornings. The clean nightgown smelled of starch and sunlight. The nightgown at the end of the week smelled faintly of sleep. This is not an unpleasant smell collection. Taken together it is warm, slightly sweet, slightly mineral, with the clean linen note dominant and the other notes layered beneath it. It is a specifically Victorian indoor smell, and I suspect that if you could step into a well-kept middle-class Victorian bedroom at 10 o'clock on a winter night, you would find it surprisingly comfortable and surprisingly unfamiliar at the same time. There is the question of who else might be in the Victorian bedroom at night, beyond the woman herself and potentially her husband. In households with young children, a child's nighttime illness or nightmare or simple need for reassurance brought the child into the parent's bedroom with a frequency that Victorian domestic writing records without surprise. The convention of the child coming into the parent's bed when frightened or remaining in the parent's room during illness was not challenged by Victorian domestic ideology the way it is occasionally challenged by modern parenting theory. The Victorian child who climbed into the parental bed at 2 in the morning had probably always been allowed to do this as a matter of course, and the Victorian mother who made room for them did so without the theoretical framework that would make it either a deliberate choice or a considered pedagogical position. It was simply what happened. The sick child in the parents' room, or the mother sitting up in the nursery through a difficult night, represented one of the more consistent disruptions of the Victorian woman's personal night routine. When a child was seriously ill, the mother's own sleep was essentially suspended for the duration. She sat up in a chair beside the bed, or she lay down in her clothes to be available without the delay of redressing. The Victorian nursing literature on sick children, which was extensive, acknowledged that this work fell primarily to the mother and addressed itself to her with advice about maintaining her own health during a prolonged period of nursing. Rest when you can, eat regularly even when anxiety suppresses the appetite, accept help when it is offered. The sister, the friend, the female neighbor who came to help during illness or childbirth or other household crises and slept in a spare room or shared the bed, these temporary presences in the Victorian household reshaped the night in their periods of occupancy. Victorian women's friendship networks were practically organized as much as they were emotionally organized. The network of women who could be called upon and who called upon others in turn was a genuine social infrastructure, and its operation was visible in the household's night geography during difficult periods. Let me take you now to a specific Victorian woman whose night routines are documented in enough detail to tell a full story. Her name was Eleanor Vere Boyle, and she was an artist, a book illustrator who worked primarily in the 1850s and 1860s, known for her delicate fairy tale imagery. The wife of a clergyman and the mother of several children, she kept a diary intermittently through the middle decades of the Victorian era, and portions of it were published after her death. The diary's quality is uneven, but includes passages of real observation about the texture of private life. Eleanor's night routine, reconstructed from the diary entries, was simpler than the most elaborate version we have been describing. Her household was modestly provided with servants. Her personal style was quietly unfashionable, even for the period, and she was not particularly invested in the more elaborate forms of Victorian beauty culture. The hair routine happened. She notes the brushing and braiding with the matter-of-fact brevity of something too routine to require comment, except on the occasional evening when her youngest daughter sat with her and helped with the braiding, which she noted with a warmth that suggests it was a pleasure to her. The skincare was minimal, cold cream applied, as she notes once when it ran out and she had to improvise with almond oil, as if the cold cream's absence required explanation. The prayers are present throughout. She was the wife of a clergyman, and her faith was genuine and informed, and the evening prayers were serious and personal rather than formulaic. What she wrote about most in her diary's late-night entries was her work. She was thinking about the illustrations she was making, the lines that weren't quite right, the compositions that needed re-seeing, the problem she had been working on in her head all day while doing other things, and that had resolved itself, or not resolved itself, by the time she came to write about it at the end of the evening. The bedroom was where the professional self and the personal self coexisted, because there was no study set aside for her use, no studio, no space formally designated for the work that was her vocation as well as her income. The work happened in the available spaces, and the thinking about the work happened in the available hours, which meant the night. She describes a specific habit that I find rather beautiful, the practice of drawing in a small sketchbook by candlelight before sleep, not to produce anything finished or significant, but simply to let the hand move across paper in the way it needed to move, following whatever images the day had accumulated in the back of the mind. The sketchbook from this practice, full of small, quick drawings made in low light, slightly wavering in line, has survived in a collection and was reproduced in a later study of her work. The sketchbook drawings are not her best work. They are, in many ways, not even particularly good drawings in technical terms, but they have a quality of private honesty that her finished published illustrations, beautiful as they are, do not quite have. They are what she was thinking about at midnight, by herself, in the dark of her bedroom. That is worth something that technical achievement doesn't quite measure, something that Victorian domestic writing returns to again and again, and that is worth naming as a theme, is the idea of the bedroom as a space for private emotional expression. The Victorian public world demanded an emotional regulation from women that was quite specific: calm, pleasant, even-tempered, supportive, accommodating. The expression of anger was almost never permitted. The expression of unhappiness or discontent was problematic at best, a symptom of ingratitude or nervous weakness at worst. The expression of strong feeling of any kind, unless channeled into the specifically approved modes of maternal love or religious devotion, was looked at sideways. The private world, and specifically the bedroom, was where other things happened. The Victorian woman who wept in the privacy of her room was not being dramatic or indulgent. She was accessing an emotional register that the daylight hours would not permit. The grief that could not be shown at the funeral because propriety required a certain management of public grief. The frustration of a specific situation that had no available remedy. The loneliness of a marriage that was working correctly in every observable way and that was nonetheless lonely. The anger. Victorian women in their private writing express anger with a frequency and intensity that the public record of demure Victorian womanhood does not quite prepare you for, because in the private space of the diary written at night, it was possible to say what you were not allowed to say out loud. The bedroom was the space where this happened. Tears, rage, occasionally, in the sharp sentences of the midnight diary entry. The particular grief of unanswered desire, not romantic desire specifically, though sometimes that, but the desire for a different kind of life, a larger sphere, more time, more recognition, more room to be the full extent of what you were. And then, having felt it, having written it or wept it, or simply lain with it in the dark, the Victorian woman returned to the surface. The diary was closed, the candle went out, the morning was coming, with its requirements, the night had given her what it could give. The ending of the Victorian era which we conventionally date to Victoria's death in January 1901, brought changes to the night routine that were already well underway by the 1890s. Electric light was coming into houses. The first true domestic electric installations in England began in the 1880s in the most progressive households, and by the 1890s a growing number of middle-class homes in cities were being wired. Electric light was a transformation of a different order from any previous lighting innovation. It was not just brighter than gas or candles, it was categorically different, on or off, immediately available, requiring no maintenance, producing no fumes, carrying no risk of fire. The bedroom by electric light was a different room from the bedroom by candlelight, and this difference had consequences for the rhythm of the evening that were not fully anticipated. Gaslight had been brighter than candles, but still of the same fundamentally limited, localizable, warm kind. You still moved toward the light source rather than having the light fill the room from above. Electric light overhead was something new, even, full, shadowless in a way that candlelight was never shadowless. It extended the workable evening significantly. You could read without positioning yourself carefully in relation to the light source. You could do detailed sewing work without moving to a specific chair with a specific lamp at a specific angle. You could look at your face in the mirror with a clarity that candlelight had softened but electricity made sharp. This sharpness was not always welcome in the bedroom context. The Victorian dressing table mirror by candlelight had a forgiving quality. Electric light had none. Some Victorian women, adapting to the new lighting, preferred to keep their dressing table rituals by candlelight for longer than the household technology required, because the gentler light was easier to spend time in. The new hygiene science of the late Victorian and Edwardian period was beginning to transform the skincare ritual as well. Germ theory, which had become generally understood by the educated public through the 1880s and 1890s following Pasteur's and Lister's work, changed the framework within which bodily care was understood. The skin was no longer just a surface to be maintained aesthetically. It was a barrier with specific defensive properties that could be compromised by specific practices. Washing was more important in the new framework than it had been in the old miasma and humours framework. The cleansing step of the night skin routine, which had always been present, became explicitly understood as hygiene rather than merely cosmetic preparation. The commercial skincare market was expanding rapidly at the end of the century. Proprietary preparations with branded names were displacing the homemade preparations from household receipt books, and the advertising of these preparations in the women's magazines that were increasingly prominent in the market was shaping what Victorian women thought they needed and wanted in ways that the previous generation's more word-of-mouth knowledge network had not quite managed. What remained constant through all the decades of the Victorian era, through all the specific changes in fashionable silhouette and available technology and religious emphasis and social structure, was the fundamental rhythm of the Victorian woman's night, the retreat to the bedroom, the preparation of the face and hair, the removal of the day's clothing and the imposition of the night's, the prayers, the reading or writing in the private hours, the settling towards sleep. These elements, arranged and managed in ways that varied by decade and by individual and by circumstance, composed the specific music of the Victorian night. And like all music, it had themes that recurred: the physical relief of the corset's removal, the meditative quality of the hair-brushing, the particular peace of the dressing table with its rose-water and cold cream, the candle going out, the darkness, always, finally, the darkness, which was not nothing, which was the end of the performance and the beginning of whatever was most genuinely private, which was where the prayers went and where the grief was allowed and where the mind returned to the problems and the pleasures that the day had not given it room to address. The Victorian woman in the darkness of her bedroom was not simply resting. She was living the portion of her life that was fully her own, and that portion, small, constrained, guarded on all sides by the requirements of everything she was expected to be, was no less real for being small. It was, in fact, the most real. There is something I have been thinking about as I put this story together, and I want to say it before we conclude because I think it matters. The Victorian night routine was, from one angle, a collection of practices required by a particular historical moment, by the technology of the corset, by the absence of running water, by the specific ideology of Victorian femininity, by the class structure that made some of these practices possible and others impossible. From that angle, it was contingent, historical, specific to a world that has ended. But from another angle, the Victorian night routine was the expression of something that has nothing to do with corsets or candlelight or the particular texture of beeswax cold cream. It was the expression of the human need, at the end of a day of performance and management and obligation, to tend to oneself, to care for the body with deliberate attention, to prepare the mind for rest with some kind of ritual that marks the transition, to pray or to reflect or to write or to read, to do something in those private hours that is not for anyone else's benefit but one's own. That need has not changed. The specific forms it takes have changed enormously and will keep changing, and some of the changes have been definitively good. But the underlying need for the private hour, for the ritual of self-care, for the gradual unwinding from the public self toward the private one, that is as present in a 21st century bedroom as it was in a Victorian one. The woman who spends 10 minutes on her skincare before sleep, who charges her phone outside the bedroom so the last hour is genuinely quiet, who reads something on paper instead of a screen because the quality of that attention is different, she is not performing Victorian domesticity. She is following the same instinct that sent her great-great-grandmother to the dressing table, that led a tired woman in 1875 to sit down in front of the mirror and begin removing pins from her hair one by one. The instinct survives the era. The rituals change, the instinct remains. The last thing I want to tell you about before the Victorian night finally closes is the sound of the house settling. Victorian houses had a specific acoustic quality at night when they were fully quiet and fully occupied with sleeping people. The wooden structures, the joists and rafters and floorboards of the interior contracted as the temperature dropped through the night and expanded again toward morning as the warmth built up. This thermal movement produced sounds, small creaks, occasional sharper pops, the particular sound of a building breathing through the night cycle. People who lived in Victorian houses knew these sounds intimately. They were part of the nighttime acoustic landscape, familiar and unremarkable in the same way that urban dwellers learn to ignore traffic or rural dwellers ignore wind. The settling of the house was not something you noted consciously after the first few weeks of living in it. It simply became part of the background of sleep. But on the first night in a new house, the night the young bride spent in her own household for the first time, or the night the woman who had moved after her husband's death spent in the rented rooms, or the family member's spare room, those sounds were unfamiliar and therefore present, and therefore something she lay awake attending to, learning the voice of the new house, incorporating it. There is a Victorian domestic formulation that appears in various contexts. The phrase "well settled" used to describe a household that was running smoothly, a family that was comfortably established, a woman who had made her home properly. To be well settled was to have arrived at the stable state after the movement and disruption of beginnings. It was the condition that the night routine, repeated over time, gradually produced. The Victorian woman who was well settled in her household lay in her bed at night and heard the settling sounds of her house and knew them, knew the particular sound of that particular staircase contracting in the cold, knew the sound of that particular window frame finding its equilibrium, knew the house the way you can only know it after years of intimate acquaintance. That knowing was a form of belonging. It was the result of hundreds of nights spent in this specific bedroom, listening to this specific house, in the specific darkness of this specific life. Not the life she might have had, not the life the world told her was the right one, the best one, the one whose picture hung in the moral imagination of the era, her actual life, the one made of these specific nights and these specific rituals and this specific settling darkness. In the small hours, when the prayers were said and the candle was out and the Victorian night was doing what all nights do, slowly, reliably, generously moving toward morning, that belonging was enough. It was enough. Thank you for being here with me tonight on Sleepy Old World. We have travelled a long way together through the Victorian night, through the hairpins and the cold cream and the 100 brush strokes and the corset hooks and the chamber candlestick moving through the darkened house, through the prayers said quietly in the dark, through the diary written late, honest in the way the daylight didn't quite permit, through the letters to sisters and friends that carried the truest things, through the novels read in bed, the Hardy, the Collins, the Eliot, and the dreams that followed, Through all of it, the specific, unrepeatable, daily reality of women living their private nights within the constraints of a world that asked a great deal of them in the daylight hours and gave them, in the nighttime ones, this small gift of solitude and candlelight and the quiet work of tending to themselves. The Victorian house at night was a world of organized darkness and carefully maintained fire. Understanding what it felt like to move through it after the household had settled, to carry your candlestick from room to room, to check the windows, to look in on the children, to go back down for the book you forgot, is part of understanding what the Victorian evening actually was. The candlestick she carried was almost certainly the standard chamber stick, a broad, shallow saucer of pottery or metal with a short central holder for the candle and a ring handle on the side. The breadth of the saucer was practical. It caught the drips of melting wax, it provided a stable base, and it could be set down on any surface without risk of tipping. The handle allowed it to be carried through doorways and around furniture without the careful two-handed balance that a taller candlestick would require. It was a working object, functional rather than decorative, and it was found in every Victorian household of every class. The quality of candlelight in a Victorian house at night was both more and less than we tend to imagine, more than the barely there suggestion of modern candles lit for atmosphere, less than any electric light at all. A single good candle, beeswax, which burned cleaner and brighter than tallow, produced something that our eyes, accustomed to artificial light, would find surprisingly adequate. You could read by one candle held at the right distance. You could see the details of a room you knew well. You could navigate a familiar staircase safely enough. But the darkness at the edges was real. The corners of a Victorian room, beyond the candle's reach, were genuinely dark. The staircase above the candle's glow was dark. The landing between one room and the next was dark, unless another candle was burning somewhere ahead. The Victorian night was full of gradations, pools of warm light, zones of dimness, pockets of real dark, and moving through it was a physical and perceptual experience quite different from switching on a light switch. Gas lighting, where it had reached Victorian homes by the middle decades of the century, changed some of this. Gas wall fixtures in the principal rooms, the parlour, the dining room, the hallway, provided a steadier, brighter light than candles and could be left burning at a low level for some hours without the constant management that candles required. But gas was not universally installed even in urban middle-class homes through much of the Victorian period, and where it was installed it was confined to the downstairs rooms used for entertaining and living. The bedrooms remained candlelit throughout most of the era. The kitchen remained candlelit. The back stairs, the servants' quarters, the upper floors of most Victorian houses were managed by candlelight right through to the electric conversion, which came to most middle-class homes only in the final decade of the century at the very earliest, and often much later than that. The woman carrying her chamber stick upstairs at the end of the evening moved from gas light to candlelight as she crossed from the public to the private spaces of her house. This was not a purely symbolic transition, though the symbolism was there. It was a literal change in the quality of illumination that she moved through. The world above the first landing was the candlelit world, the older world, the world that operated on a different visual register from the modernity below. I want to talk about the Victorian woman's relationship with her bedroom in winter more fully, because winter was the dominant season of the Victorian night in a psychological sense, even if it lasted only a few months. Winter condensed the day. It made the evenings long and the mornings dark and the nights cold in ways that compressed everything that happened in the private hours into a kind of intensity. The fire in the grate was not a comfort option, it was a necessity. The pile of blankets was not aesthetic excess, it was survival. The hot drink, the warm milk, the beef tea, the cup of cocoa that became fashionable in the latter Victorian decades was not a luxury treat. It was the body's reasonable request for warmth from the inside when the warmth from the outside had become inadequate. Cocoa deserves its own moment here, because it is a very specifically Victorian arrival in the bedroom night routine. Cocoa, or more precisely, the drinking chocolate preparations marketed from the 1860s onward under names that have survived almost unchanged to the present, was a relatively new presence in the Victorian household by the middle decades of the century. The cocoa plant had been known in Europe since the 16th century, but the processed forms that made it easy to dissolve and drink were mid-Victorian innovations. Cadbury's cocoa powder, introduced in 1866 using what was then a new Dutch process technique for removing excess cocoa butter, was a significantly more palatable drink than the earlier preparations, which were often greasy and difficult to mix. By the 1870s and 1880s, a cup of cocoa before bed had become a middle-class habit sufficiently well established to appear in domestic advice books as a standard bedtime provision. It was warm, it was sweet. It contained, as we now know and the Victorians were beginning to suspect in pharmacological terms, theobromine, a compound that has mild stimulant properties but also, paradoxically, mild relaxant effects on smooth muscle, which may have contributed to the cocoa cup's reputation as a sleep aid. It also contained a genuinely significant amount of sugar in most Victorian preparations, and the quick energy provided by that sugar was followed by the inevitable drop that would have contributed to the drowsiness that followed. The bedtime cocoa cup was brought up by the housemaid or made by the woman herself in the kitchen before coming upstairs. In households where the kitchen was several flights of stairs away from the bedroom, bringing the cocoa up still hot required some advanced planning and a reasonably insulated cup arrangement. A thick pottery mug was better than a thin china one for this purpose, though china was considered more correct, which created its own small domestic dilemma. The drinking of the cocoa was one of the last of the night's sequential acts before the candle went out. It belonged to the sitting up in bed portion of the evening, after the nightgown was on and the prayers said and the reading done. It was warm in the hands and warm going down, and it concluded the evening in a small, bodily, satisfying way. The smell of it in the dark Victorian bedroom, warm chocolate, a little sweet, is something I find oddly evocative when I think about it. A smell associated now with childhood and cold evenings and the kitchen when you are 9 years old and someone is making something comforting. In a Victorian bedroom in January, for a tired woman at the end of a long day, it must have felt something like that too. The question of what a Victorian woman's night looked like when she was unwell is a distinct subchapter, because Victorian women were unwell rather a lot by modern standards, and the management of ill health at home was a significant component of the Victorian domestic knowledge base. Victorian women's health was compromised in specific ways by the conditions of their lives. The corset, as we have discussed, created real physical problems for some wearers: restricted breathing, altered posture, occasional digestive disruption. The limited physical exercise available to many middle-class women, particularly in the earlier Victorian decades, when vigorous outdoor exercise was considered unfeminine, contributed to what Victorian physicians called nervous debility and what we might call poor cardiovascular fitness. The standard Victorian diet, heavy in meat and refined carbohydrates and relatively light in fresh vegetables, particularly in winter, contributed to various nutritional deficiencies. Anemia was common, headaches were common. The cluster of symptoms that the Victorians grouped under the label of neuralgia, generalized nerve pain, often centered in the face or head, was a persistent complaint in the diaries of women who were otherwise in reasonable health. Menstrual difficulties were rarely spoken of directly in the diaries and letters that have survived, because Victorian propriety resisted this territory even in private writing. But the domestic advice books on women's health make clear that they were a significant source of recurring monthly suffering for many women. The Victorian woman who was unwell at night retreated further into the bedroom rather than going out from it. The sick room, in Victorian domestic medicine, was a managed environment with specific protocols: fresh air, but not drafts; warmth, but not stuffiness; quiet, but not the oppressive silence that suggested the condition was serious. The diet in illness was carefully graduated, from beef tea and arrowroot gruel at the beginning of an illness, to more substantial things as recovery progressed. The nursing of illness within the household fell primarily to the women. This is not surprising given the general structure of Victorian domestic responsibility, but it created a particular irony in the case of the woman who was herself unwell, who nursed the nurse. In practice, other women, neighbours who took turns, family members who came to stay, the housemaid who was occasionally deputized beyond her usual duties, but the expectation of the era placed the ill woman herself in a curious position. expected to be the manager of her own illness in a way that her household's well-being required, even while also being the patient. There is a letter from a woman in the 1860s who describes managing a sick household, husband with influenza, 2 children with the same, herself beginning to feel the early signs, with a dry humour that does not entirely disguise the genuine exhaustion. "I am nursing everyone," she writes to her sister, "and I find that the most efficient method is to become ill oneself last, as there is then at least someone left standing to provide the gruel." She became ill last, she recovered last. She wrote this letter, the historian who found it noted, probably while sitting up in bed, the letter writing, the correspondence, the specific activity of writing letters in the late evening or by lamplight in the bedroom. This deserves more attention than I gave it earlier, because it was one of the most significant things Victorian women did in their private hours, and one of the things that preserved for us the record we have of what those hours actually contained. Victorian letter writing was not what we do now when we send an email. It was not even what we do when we write a reasonably considered message to someone we care about. Victorian letter writing was a genre with conventions, a practice with standards, and for many middle-class women, a genuine creative and intellectual undertaking. The letter required the correct paper. For women of the middle classes, this was typically a quarto sheet, slightly larger than modern A5, of white or cream writing paper of good quality. Poorer quality paper was available for less important correspondence. The better quality paper was reserved for important connections. The paper might have a small engraved heading with the house address and sometimes a decorative device, modest, understated, because ostentation in stationery was considered vulgar. The pen in the mid-Victorian period was the steel-nibbed dip pen, the quill having been gradually displaced through the 1840s. The dip pen was dipped into an inkwell at regular intervals, every several words or when the nib ran dry, which introduced a specific rhythm to the writing process. You wrote a phrase, dipped, wrote another. This was not quite the uninterrupted flow of modern writing instruments. It created its own pace. The handwriting itself was an art form. Victorian penmanship, the specific styles taught in schools throughout the period, with their careful formation of letters, their controlled flourishes, their consistent slope and weight, was considered a direct reflection of character. Bad handwriting implied carelessness of mind, lack of discipline, inattentiveness to the requirements of social communication. Good handwriting implied the opposite. Victorian women's handwriting, in the letters and diaries that survive, is often remarkably beautiful by our standards, elegant, consistent, clearly the product of sustained training and practice. Writing in the evening, in the bedroom, was a different experience from writing at the desk in the morning. The evening writing was more personal, more likely to be the letter to the close friend rather than the letter to the house agent, more likely to contain something true. The diary entry written at the end of the day, when the events of it were still immediate, had a rawness that the properly ordered letter did not quite permit. There is a tradition in Victorian women's correspondence of the late-night letter, the letter that begins by noting the hour, that acknowledges the particular quality of writing in the dark, when the house is quiet, that allows a different register of speech than the letter written during proper hours. These letters are often the most interesting ones to read, the most alive. They were written by women who had more to say than the day had given them time for, and who found in the private hours of the night a space to say it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's letters, and she was one of the great letter writers of the Victorian era, a status that her fame as a poet has somewhat obscured, often have this quality. Written from her bedroom at Wimpole Street, from the room that was her world for the years of her semi-confinement, they are alive with intelligence and feeling in a way that the public record of her life as an invalid does not quite capture. She was in those letters, herself in the most complete sense. The invalid role was partly real and partly the frame the world imposed, and in the late-night letters you can see the woman stepping slightly outside the frame. I want to talk about what Victorian women read in bed specifically, because the choice of reading matter reveals something about the inner life of the bedtime hours that generalizations do not quite convey. The novel, which we have already noted was the dominant literary form of the era, was also the dominant bedtime reading. But there is a particular kind of Victorian novel that seems to have been especially well suited to the late-night reading and that comes up repeatedly in the accounts of what women were reading in their private hours. The sensation novel of the 1860s, the genre associated with Wilkie Collins, with Mrs. Henry Wood, with Mary Elizabeth Braddon, was considered by many contemporary commentators to be exactly the wrong kind of thing to read before sleep, too stimulating, too exciting, too likely to produce the agitated mental state that interfered with restful sleep. Collins' The Woman in White, with its elaborate plot of identity and imprisonment and conspiracy, was not designed to settle the mind. East Lynne, Mrs. Wood's enormously successful melodrama of adultery and its consequences, was not a calming text. Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, with its murderous golden-haired heroine, was considered rather definitively unsuitable for the small hours. The fact that Victorian women read these novels in bed anyway, and in considerable numbers judging by the sales figures and the circulation records of lending libraries, tells you something about the relationship between the Victorian woman and her private reading. The public advice about what was appropriate reading material for women was one thing, the private choice was another. The sensation novel was exciting in the way that not very much in the regulated surface of Victorian middle-class female life was permitted to be exciting. It involved women doing unexpected things with unexpected energy and occasionally with unexpected moral complexity. It was, in the private hours of the night, a small rebellion, not dramatic, not dangerous, but real. Trollope was more respectable for the bedtime hours and was widely read by women with good conscience, his novels being on the long and comfortable side and providing the kind of extensive, well-observed domestic and social world that a reader could inhabit gradually without agitation. Hardy was more troubling. His women were often beautifully drawn and also often ruined, and the darkness at the end of his plots was not the straightforwardly resolved darkness that the sensation novel dealt in. Hardy's Tess, published in 1891, was deeply controversial and deeply read. George Eliot's novels, Middlemarch in particular, published in installments in 1871 and 1872, were considered serious reading, the kind of reading that demanded more of the mind than could be offered at the tail end of a tired day. And yet Middlemarch, which is about the specific, irreversible constraints of women's lives, and about the ways that great souls can be confined within small circumstances, was read by Victorian women with a recognition that the author had not missed in her analysis. The growing good of the world, Eliot wrote at the novel's end, is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. If you read that in bed, in a Victorian bedroom, at the end of a day of unhistoric acts, in a life that would not be visited by history, I think you would feel something. The sound of the Victorian night outside the bedroom window is something worth dwelling on, because it was neither silent nor like the sounds of the modern night. The Victorian city at night had specific sounds that are entirely absent from our experience. The gas lamp in the street below gave off a faint hiss, not intrusive, barely audible from a closed window, but present in the background. The horses that still moved through Victorian streets even at night created a specific sound on the cobblestones, the clopping, uneven rhythm of iron shoes on stone that is absent from any modern soundscape. Victorian streets in cities were cobblestoned, and the acoustic quality of cobblestones is quite different from tarmac. Sharper, more resonant, the sound carrying further. The new hygiene science of the late Victorian and Edwardian period was beginning to transform the skincare ritual as well. Germ theory, which had become generally understood by the educated public through the 1880s and 1890s following Pasteur's and Lister's work, changed the framework within which bodily care was understood. The skin was no longer just a surface to be maintained aesthetically, it was a barrier with specific defensive properties that could be compromised by specific practices. Washing was more important in the new framework than it had been in the old miasma and humours framework. The cleansing step of the night skin routine, which had always been present, became explicitly understood as hygiene rather than merely cosmetic preparation. The commercial skincare market was expanding rapidly at the end of the century. Proprietary preparations with branded names were displacing the homemade preparations from household receipt books, and the advertising of these preparations in the women's magazines that were increasingly prominent in the market was shaping what Victorian women thought they needed and wanted in ways that the previous generation's more word-of-mouth knowledge network had not quite managed. What remained constant through all the decades of the Victorian era, through all the specific changes in fashionable silhouette and available technology and religious emphasis and social structure, was the fundamental rhythm of the Victorian woman's night, the retreat to the bedroom, the preparation of the face and hair, the removal of the day's clothing and the imposition of the nights, the prayers, the reading or writing in the private hours, the settling towards sleep. These elements, arranged and managed in ways that varied by decade and by individual and by circumstance, composed the specific music of the Victorian night, and like all music, it had themes that recurred: the physical relief of the corset's removal, the meditative quality of the hair brushing, the particular piece of the dressing table with its rose water and cold cream, the candle going out, the darkness, always, finally, the darkness, which was not nothing, which was the end of the performance and the beginning of whatever was most genuinely private, which was where the prayers went and where the grief was allowed and where the mind returned to the problems and the pleasures that the day had not given it room to address. The Victorian woman in the darkness of her bedroom was not simply resting, she was living the portion of her life that was fully her own, and that portion, small, constrained, guarded on all sides by the requirements of everything she was expected to be, was no less real for being small. It was, in fact, the most real. There is something I have been thinking about as I put this story together, and I want to say it before we conclude because I think it matters. The Victorian night routine was, from one angle, a collection of practices required by a particular historical moment, by the technology of the corset, by the absence of running water, by the specific ideology of Victorian femininity, by the class structure that made some of these practices possible and others impossible. From that angle, it was contingent, historical, specific to a world that has ended. But from another angle, the Victorian night routine was the expression of something that has nothing to do with corsets or candlelight or the particular texture of beeswax cold cream. It was the expression of the human need, at the end of a day of performance and management and obligation, to tend to oneself, to care for the body with deliberate attention, to prepare the mind for rest with some kind of ritual that marks the transition, to pray or to reflect or to write or to read, to do something in those private hours that is not for anyone else's benefit but one's own. That need has not changed. The specific forms it takes have changed enormously and will keep changing, and some of the changes have been definitively good. But the underlying need for the private hour, for the ritual of self-care, for the gradual unwinding from the public self toward the private one, that is as present in a 21st century bedroom as it was in a Victorian one. The woman who spends 10 minutes on her skincare before sleep, who charges her phone outside the bedroom so the last hour is genuinely quiet, who reads something on paper instead of a screen because the quality of that attention is different, she is not performing Victorian domesticity. She is following the same instinct that sent her great-great-grandmother to the dressing table, that led a tired woman in 1875 to sit down in front of the mirror and begin removing pins from her hair one by one. The instinct survives the era, the rituals change, the instinct remains. The last thing I want to tell you about, before the Victorian night finally closes, is the sound of the house settling. Victorian houses had a specific acoustic quality at night when they were fully quiet and fully occupied with sleeping people. The wooden structures, the joists and rafters and floorboards of the interior, contracted as the temperature dropped through the night and expanded again toward morning as the warmth built up. This thermal movement produced sounds, small creaks, occasional sharper pops, the particular sound of a building breathing through the night cycle. People who lived in Victorian houses knew these sounds intimately. They were part of the nighttime acoustic landscape, familiar and unremarkable in the same way that urban dwellers learn to ignore traffic or rural dwellers ignore wind. The settling of the house was not something you noted consciously after the first few weeks of living in it. It simply became part of the background of sleep. But on the first night in a new house, the night the young bride spent in her own household for the first time, or the night the woman who had moved after her husband's death spent in the rented rooms or the family member's spare room, those sounds were unfamiliar and therefore present and therefore something she lay awake attending to. Learning the voice of the new house, incorporating it. There is a Victorian domestic formulation that appears in various contexts. The phrase "well settled," used to describe a household that was running smoothly, a family that was comfortably established, a woman who had made her home properly. To be well settled was to have arrived at the stable state after the movement and disruption of beginnings. It was the condition that the night routine, repeated over time, gradually produced. The Victorian woman who was well settled in her household lay in her bed at night and heard the settling sounds of her house and knew them, knew the particular sound of that particular staircase contracting in the cold, knew the sound of that particular window frame finding its equilibrium, knew the house the way you can only know it after years of intimate acquaintance. That knowing was a form of belonging. It was the result of hundreds of nights spent in this specific bedroom, listening to this specific house, in the specific darkness of this specific life, not the life she might have had, not the life the world told her was the right one, the best one, the one whose picture hung in the moral imagination of the era, her actual life, the one made of these specific nights and these specific rituals and this specific settling darkness. In the small hours, when the prayers were said and the candle was out and the Victorian night was doing what all nights do, slowly, reliably, generously moving toward morning, that belonging was enough. It was enough. Thank you for being here with me tonight on Sleepy Old World. We have travelled a long way together through the Victorian night, through the hairpins and the cold cream and the 100 brush strokes and the corset hooks and the chamber candlestick moving through the darkened house, through the prayers said quietly in the dark, through the diary written late, honest in the way the daylight didn't quite permit, through the letters to sisters and friends that carried the truest things, through the novels read in bed, the Hardy, the Collins, the Eliot, and the dreams that followed, through all of it, the specific, unrepeatable, daily reality of women living their private nights within the constraints of a world that asked a great deal of them in the daylight hours, and gave them in the nighttime ones this small gift of solitude and candlelight and the quiet work of tending to themselves. I hope something in this story stayed with you, a detail that surprised you, a woman whose night felt strangely familiar, a ritual that made you think about your own. If Sleepy Old World is the right company for your late hours, please subscribe. Come back. There are more nights like this one ahead of us, more worlds to step into together, more ordinary lives worth every minute of our attention.